For thousands of years, Zen masters have observed something simple yet profound about our lives. Most of our struggle doesn't come from our circumstances. It comes from how our minds respond to circumstances. Tonight, we'll journey through ancient stories about people who discovered freedom from these patterns. Before we begin, feel free to share what time it is and where you're listening from. The people in these stories found peace not through complex techniques or years of effort, but through simple seeing. Through recognizing what the mind was doing and watching those patterns lose their power. These aren't lessons to memorize or truths to force yourself to believe. They're invitations to notice what might already be true. As we move through these teachings together, you might find your breathing naturally slowing, your body naturally releasing tension it's been holding. There's nothing you need to accomplish here. Nothing to understand perfectly. Just let these stories unfold, one after another, like gentle waves. Take a slow, deep breath, and let's begin our journey together. The ancient teachers of Zen Buddhism understood something simple about human suffering. They noticed that our unhappiness rarely comes from what is actually happening. Instead, it comes from our mind's response to what is happening. The mind moves in two directions. It reaches toward what it wants, but doesn't have, and it pulls away from what it has, but doesn't want. This constant movement, this endless reaching and resisting, creates most of our struggle. In a prosperous village along the merchant road lived a pottery maker named Hiroshi. His workshop sat at the edge of town, its chimney visible from quite a distance. Travelers would stop specifically to see his work. His bowls were praised for their perfect weight and balance. His vases had a subtle glaze that seemed to change color depending on the light. Other potters in neighboring villages tried to copy his techniques, but could never quite match his skill. Hiroshi had built this success through years of dedicated work. He owned his workshop outright, with no debts to repay. His home was comfortable, with thick walls and a good roof. His wife was gentle and patient. His 2 children were healthy and quick to laugh. His pantry stayed full. His kiln fired true. By any reasonable measure, his life was good. Yet Hiroshi felt a constant restlessness, like a stone in his shoe that he couldn't quite remove. When a customer purchased 3 tea bowls, Hiroshi would find himself thinking about the large serving platter that remained unsold. When he finally sold the platter, his mind would immediately jump to the new wheel he wanted to purchase. When he bought the wheel, he began planning for a larger kiln. When the larger kiln was built, he started thinking about opening a second workshop in the next town. His wife, Yuki, noticed this pattern clearly. She would watch him in the evenings, supposedly resting after a day of work, but his eyes were distant. His mind was clearly somewhere else. "Hiroshi," she said one evening as they ate their meal together, "you have everything you once told me you dreamed of having. We have a good home. The children are well. Your work is respected throughout the region. Yet you seem troubled. What weighs on your mind?" Hiroshi looked up from his bowl, surprised by the question. "I'm not troubled," he said, a bit defensively. "I'm planning. There's so much more we could achieve. The workshop in the next town would double our income. Then we could afford..." "Afford what?" Yuki asked gently. "We have everything we need." "I know," Hiroshi said, but even as he spoke, his mind was already moving ahead to the next thing. "But we could have more. Better things. security for the future, opportunities for the children. Yuki was quiet for a moment. When you built your first kiln, you told me that once you had a successful workshop, you would finally feel content. Now you have that, and you speak of needing more. I wonder if you will feel content even with 2 workshops. Hiroshi didn't answer. He returned to his meal, but her words stayed with him like a seed planted in hard soil. The next afternoon, a traveling monk stopped at Hiroshi's workshop. The monk was old, his robe patched in several places. He carried nothing but a wooden bowl and a walking stick worn smooth from years of use. He entered the workshop and stood for a long time looking at the pottery displayed on the shelves. "These are beautiful," the monk said finally, his voice soft with genuine appreciation. Hiroshi, who had been wedging clay in the corner, came over. He was used to compliments about his work and had learned to accept them gracefully. "Thank you. Would you like to purchase something?" The monk smiled. "I have no money to offer you. I am simply enjoying the beauty of your creations." Hiroshi felt a flash of irritation. Time was valuable, and this old man was wasting it. What use is enjoying something if you can't own it? He asked, more harshly than he intended. The monk didn't seem offended. He picked up one of Hiroshi's finest bowls, a piece that had taken days to shape and glaze perfectly. He held it with great care, turning it slowly in his weathered hands. "When I hold this bowl," the monk said quietly, "I experience its weight. I feel how it fits perfectly between my palms. I see how the glaze moves from deep blue to pale green. I notice this small irregularity here, which makes it unique among all bowls ever made. These experiences are mine completely, even though the bowl belongs to you." He set the bowl down with great gentleness, as if saying goodbye to a friend. Then he walked toward the workshop entrance, pausing at the doorway. "The sunset this evening will be extraordinary," he said, looking at the western sky. "I own none of it. I cannot keep it in my house or carry it with me. Yet I will possess the entire experience. Every color, every moment of fading light. It will be mine in a way that ownership could never provide." The monk bowed slightly and continued on his way, leaving Hiroshi standing in his workshop surrounded by beautiful objects, feeling somehow hollow. That evening, instead of sketching plans for his second workshop as he usually did, Hiroshi found himself thinking about the monk's words. When the sun began to set, he walked outside and sat on the ground near his kiln. The sky was doing exactly what the monk had predicted. Deep orange spread across the horizon, bleeding into pink, then purple, then a dark blue that seemed to hold all the colors within it. Hiroshi watched the entire display. For those minutes, his mind wasn't reaching for anything else. He wasn't thinking about what he didn't have or what he wanted to build next. He wasn't planning or calculating or imagining future success. He was simply there, watching light change across the sky. And in that brief time, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years, maybe not since he was a child. A deep, quiet satisfaction that asked for nothing more than what was already present. When the last light faded, Hiroshi sat in the darkness for a while longer. He could hear his children's voices inside the house. He could smell the food Yuki was preparing. He could feel the warm earth beneath him, still holding the day's heat. All of it was his to experience fully. None of it required ownership. The next morning, Hiroshi woke to his familiar thoughts. His mind began its usual pattern of wanting, planning, reaching for the next achievement. Old habits don't disappear after one sunset. But something had shifted, just slightly. Occasionally throughout his day, he would pause and actually experience what he was doing. The feel of wet clay between his fingers, the heat of the kiln on his face, the weight of a finished bowl in his hands. These moments didn't last long. His reaching mind would quickly return, pulling him toward thoughts of future success and accumulation. But now he had tasted something different. He understood what the monk had been teaching. His restlessness wasn't caused by not having enough. It came from his mind's inability to be at peace with what was already here, already his to experience. This story illuminates what the Zen teachers called grasping. It's the mind's tendency to always reach beyond the present moment toward what it doesn't yet possess. Hiroshi had genuine abundance. His skills provided well for his family. His work brought satisfaction to many people. His life contained countless experiences of beauty and connection. Yet his mind's constant reaching toward what he didn't have prevented him from truly receiving what he did have. The Zen masters observed that grasping creates a peculiar kind of suffering. When our mind is always oriented toward the next thing, the present moment loses its clarity. We're here in body but not in awareness. Like Hiroshi working with clay while his mind planned future workshops, we go through our lives only partially present to our own experience. The monk, in this story, demonstrated something different. He owned almost nothing, yet his ability to fully receive each experience gave him a kind of wealth that couldn't be purchased. When he held Hiroshi's bowl, he truly held it. His attention wasn't divided between the bowl and thoughts about other bowls he might hold tomorrow. He was completely there with the weight, the texture, the color. This complete presence transformed a simple moment into a rich experience. This teaching doesn't suggest we should never plan for the future or work toward goals. Hiroshi's ambition had created genuine value. His skills supported his family and brought beauty into the world. The problem wasn't his success or even his desire for more success. The problem was that his reaching mind prevented him from ever feeling satisfied, from ever being fully present to the life he was actually living. Many of us carry this same pattern. We think satisfaction will come when we achieve the next milestone, acquire the next possession, reach the next level of success. But if our mind's habit is to always reach beyond what's present, no achievement will ever feel like enough. The reaching continues regardless of what we accumulate. The moment Hiroshi watched the sunset, without reaching for anything beyond it, he touched something that had been available all along. A natural peace that doesn't depend on circumstances being different. A satisfaction that comes not from having more, but from being fully present to what's already here. This is one source of our unhappiness that Zen Buddhism addresses directly. The mind's habit of grasping, always wanting what isn't present, creates a constant undercurrent of dissatisfaction. We can be surrounded by abundance, yet feel empty if our attention is always focused on what we lack rather than what we have. The second pattern the ancient masters observed was resistance. This is the mind's tendency to push away what it finds unpleasant or disagreeable. In a mountain monastery lived a young monk named Daichi. He had arrived 6 months earlier, filled with idealism about spiritual life. He imagined peaceful meditation, wise teachings, and a supportive community of fellow seekers. The reality he found was quite different from his expectations. The meditation hall was cold, especially during winter mornings. Frost would form on the inside of the windows. The wooden floor seemed to pull heat from his body during long sitting sessions. The morning bell rang well before dawn, jarring him from sleep when his body craved more rest. The food was plain, mostly rice and vegetables with little seasoning. The work periods were long and often tedious. And the other monks, rather than maintaining noble silence, were frequently noisy during their daily tasks, talking and sometimes arguing about minor matters. Daichi found himself spending most of his mental energy complaining. During meditation, when he was supposed to be settling into stillness, his mind would compose elaborate arguments about why the hall should be heated. He would mentally draft letters to the abbot explaining all the ways the monastery could be improved. He thought constantly about another monastery he had visited before choosing this one, which had warmer buildings and better food. Or he would fantasize about some future ideal monastery where conditions would finally be acceptable. Even during work periods, when he was supposed to be practicing mindful attention to his tasks, Daichi's mind was arguing with reality. Sweeping leaves, he would think about how this was a waste of time compared to meditation. Preparing vegetables, he would resent the monastery's poor diet. Sitting in the cold hall, he would silently rage against whoever had decided not to install a heating system. The abbot, Master Soto, watched Daichi's struggle with patient concern. He had seen many young monks arrive with expectations that didn't match the reality of monastery life. Some adjusted. Others left. A few, like Daichi, stayed but made themselves miserable through constant resistance to their circumstances. One particularly cold winter morning, after Daichi had complained bitterly to another monk about the freezing meditation hall, Master Soto approached him. "Daichi," the master said quietly, "would you join me for a walk?" Daichi wanted to refuse. It was cold outside, and he was already resentful about the temperature. But one didn't refuse a direct request from the abbot. He wrapped himself in his heaviest robe and followed Master Soto out into the snow. They walked in silence up the mountain path. The snow was deep, making each step difficult. The wind cut through even Daichi's thick robe. After what felt like a long time, the master stopped beside a large pine tree. "This tree grows here on the north face of the mountain," Master Soto said, brushing snow from a low branch. "The wind is harsh here. Look how the trunk bends. The soil is thin and rocky. You can see exposed roots where the earth has eroded away. The sun reaches this spot for only a few hours each day in summer, and during winter, this entire slope stays in shadow." Daichi looked at the tree more carefully. It was twisted and bent, shaped by years of strong wind. Some branches were dead, broken off by storms. But the tree was clearly alive. New growth showed at the tips of living branches. The bark was rough but healthy. There was something powerful about it, a weathered strength that came from enduring difficult conditions. "Does this tree complain about the wind?" Master Soto asked. Daichi almost smiled despite his misery. "Trees can't complain, Master." "True. They cannot speak. But imagine if this tree spent all its energy resisting the wind. Imagine if it tensed against every gust, fought against every storm, refused to bend. What would happen?" "It would break," Daichi said. "Yes. Or imagine if it refused to accept the rocky soil, if it simply stopped drawing nutrients because the soil wasn't rich enough. If it waited for someone to bring better earth, more favorable conditions." "It would die," Daichi said quietly. The tree survives, Master Soto continued, not because conditions are good, but because it doesn't waste energy resisting the conditions it finds itself in. It bends with the wind rather than breaking. It finds nutrients in poor soil. It grows toward what little sunlight reaches this slope. It doesn't spend its energy wishing for a different location. It simply grows in the place where it stands. They walked back to the monastery in silence. Daichi's mind was turning over the master's words, but he wasn't sure what to do with them. The cold hall would still be cold. The food would still be plain. His preferences hadn't changed. That afternoon during meditation, the cold air felt just as harsh as it always did. But something in Daichi shifted, just slightly. He noticed how he was holding his body, tensed against the cold as if tension could warm him. He noticed his mind, constantly arguing with the temperature, rehearsing complaints, imagining different circumstances. And then, almost experimentally, he tried something different. He stopped resisting the cold in his mind. He didn't pretend it wasn't cold or tell himself he should enjoy it. He simply stopped the internal argument about how it shouldn't be this way. The cold became just a sensation. Unpleasant, yes, but when he stopped fighting it mentally, it became somehow more manageable. The sensation itself hadn't changed, but the exhausting layer of mental resistance had lifted. Over the following weeks, Daichi experimented with this approach in other areas. When the morning bell rang before dawn, instead of lying there resenting it and mentally arguing about reasonable wake-up times, he simply got up. The tiredness was still there, but without the layer of resentment, it felt less burdensome. When the food was plain during meals, instead of mentally comparing it to better food he had eaten elsewhere, he noticed its actual taste. Rice had a subtle sweetness. The vegetables had their own distinct flavors. Without the constant mental commentary about how the food should be better, he could actually taste what was in front of him. The transformation wasn't dramatic or sudden. The monastery didn't change. The conditions remained as difficult as before. But Daichi's experience of those conditions shifted profoundly. Without the constant mental resistance, even uncomfortable situations became workable. The cold was cold, but it wasn't unbearable. The early mornings were early, but they weren't torturous. The plain food was plain, but it nourished him adequately. Years later, after Daichi had become a senior monk, younger students would often come to him with complaints about monastery life. He would listen with compassion, remembering his own early struggles. And then he would tell them about the pine tree on the north face of the mountain. The tree doesn't love the harsh wind, he would say. It doesn't pretend the conditions are pleasant. But it doesn't waste its life energy fighting what it cannot change. All that energy goes into growing instead, into becoming what it is meant to be, despite the difficulty. This teaching about resistance reveals something important that the Zen masters understood deeply. Much of our suffering comes not from difficult situations themselves, but from our mental struggle against them. When we resist what's already happening, we add a second layer of pain to the first. Daichi's cold meditation hall was genuinely uncomfortable. That was the first layer, the simple physical discomfort of cold air. But his constant mental resistance to the cold created a second layer of suffering that was far more draining than the physical sensation itself. His mind's endless complaints, arguments, and fantasies about different circumstances consumed tremendous energy and attention. This mental activity made the cold feel unbearable rather than simply uncomfortable. The Zen masters observed this pattern everywhere in human experience. Physical pain is difficult, but our mental resistance to that pain often causes more suffering than the pain itself. Difficult circumstances are challenging, but our constant mental fight against those circumstances exhausts us more than the actual challenges do. Someone's behavior bothers us, but our repeated mental complaints about their behavior disturb our peace far more than their actions do. This teaching is often misunderstood. The masters weren't suggesting we should passively accept harmful situations or never work to improve difficult circumstances. The monastery certainly could have built a warmer meditation hall. That would have been a practical improvement. Daichi could have chosen to practice at a different monastery with better conditions. That would have been a reasonable decision. But while he was there, his constant mental resistance to present reality was creating unnecessary suffering. It was preventing him from finding any peace or learning anything useful from his situation. His energy was consumed by arguing with what already was, rather than responding skillfully to his actual circumstances. The image of the pine tree is particularly helpful here. The tree faces genuinely harsh conditions, but it doesn't waste energy fighting those conditions. Instead, it adapts. It bends rather than breaking. It finds ways to grow despite the difficulty. This isn't passive acceptance. It's an active, intelligent response to reality as it actually is. When we stop resisting what's already here, we often discover resources we didn't know we had. Daichi found that without the drain of constant mental resistance, he had more energy for actual practice. He could focus better during meditation. He could bring more attention to his work. He could engage more genuinely with the other monks. This is true in our own experience as well. When we stop mentally fighting against uncomfortable sensations, difficult emotions, or challenging circumstances, we often find they're more manageable than we thought. The resistance itself was consuming more energy than dealing with the actual situation. Both of these patterns that Zen Buddhism identifies, grasping and resisting, keep the mind in constant motion. The reaching mind, always oriented toward what isn't here. The pushing mind, always trying to get away from what is here. This endless movement prevents the natural settling that allows peace to emerge. The Zen masters discovered something simple but profound. When the mind stops its constant reaching and pushing, when it's no longer grasping for what it doesn't have or resisting what it does have, a natural peace emerges. Not a peace we create through effort, but a peace that was always present beneath the mental turbulence. This is one of the central insights of Zen Buddhism. Our deepest peace doesn't come from getting everything we want or from having perfect circumstances. It comes from learning to be at rest with what is, exactly as it is, right now. As you settle more deeply now, you might notice these patterns in your own experience. Perhaps your mind reaches forward, grasping at plans or worries about tomorrow. Perhaps it resists something in this present moment, some sensation or situation you wish were different. There's no need to judge these movements. Simply noticing them with gentle awareness is enough. The teaching isn't that you must immediately stop all grasping and resistance. These are deeply conditioned patterns that have been with you for a long time. They won't disappear because you've heard a story or two. But becoming aware of them is the essential first step. When you see clearly how your mind creates suffering through its endless reaching and pushing, you gain the possibility of a different relationship with your experience. You might begin to notice moments, like Hiroshi watching the sunset, when your mind naturally settles into simple presence. Or moments like Daiichi releasing his resistance to the cold, when you stop fighting what is and find unexpected peace. These moments are doorways. They show you what becomes possible when the mind's constant movement finally comes to rest. The Zen masters observed something about human suffering that might surprise you. Much of our pain doesn't come from what actually happens to us. It comes from the meaning we assign to those events. When someone turns us away, when we're not chosen, when we don't receive what we hoped for, the experience itself is neutral. But our mind quickly creates a story about what this means about us. And that story, more than the event itself, is what causes our deepest pain. In a remote mountain region, there lived a young monk named Ryota. He had spent 3 years studying at a small temple in his home village, learning the basics of meditation, chanting, and monastic life. His teacher there was kind but aging, with limited knowledge to pass on. Ryota felt a deep hunger to deepen his practice and understanding. He wanted to study at one of the great monasteries he had heard about, places where renowned masters taught and serious practitioners gathered. With his teacher's blessing, Ryota set out on foot to find such a place. He had heard of a famous monastery 2 days' walk to the north, known for its rigorous meditation practice. When he arrived, the grounds were beautiful. Ancient cedars surrounded well-maintained buildings. The meditation hall looked peaceful and dignified. Ryota approached the gate with both excitement and nervousness. An elderly monk greeted him and asked about his purpose. Ryota explained that he wished to study there and had traveled far for this opportunity. "Wait here," the old monk said, and disappeared inside. After what felt like a long time, the monk returned with the head teacher. The teacher looked at Ryota with kind but appraising eyes. He asked several questions. Where had Ryota trained? What texts had he studied? What was his understanding of certain basic teachings? Ryota answered as best he could, but he could feel his explanations were simple, even crude compared to what this learned teacher probably expected. His 3 years of village temple training suddenly felt inadequate. After listening carefully, the teacher spoke gently. "Your sincerity is clear, but we practice a particular style of meditation here that requires specific preparation you haven't received. You would struggle to keep up with our routine. I think you would be better served finding a monastery more suited to your current level of training." Ryota felt his face grow hot. The teacher had been kind in his words, but Ryota heard only one thing: "You're not good enough for us." He thanked the teacher and left quickly, embarrassed and hurt. As he walked away from the monastery, Ryota's mind created an elaborate story. He wasn't truly cut out for serious practice. His village training had been inferior. He was probably too simple, too unsophisticated for the great monasteries. Perhaps he should just return home and give up on his aspirations. But Ryota had nowhere else to go, so he continued traveling. He had heard of another monastery to the east, though he knew less about it. The journey took 3 days. His feet hurt. His robes were dusty from the road. And now he carried the weight of his first rejection. This second monastery was smaller than the first, built around a natural hot spring. The buildings were simpler, but the grounds had a peaceful quality. A middle-aged monk with a weathered face greeted him at the gate. Again, Ryota explained his wish to study. Again, he was asked to wait while the monk consulted with the teachers. This time, Ryota felt less hopeful. He prepared himself for another rejection. When the monk returned, he brought unexpected news. "Our abbot will see you tomorrow morning. You may stay in the guest quarters tonight. There is rice and vegetables in the kitchen." The next morning, Ryota met with the abbot, a woman named Sozen, whose eyes seemed to see everything without judgment. She asked different questions than the first teacher had asked. She wanted to know why Ryota had left his home temple. What was he seeking? What made him willing to walk for days to find a new teacher? As Ryota answered, he realized she wasn't testing his knowledge. She was trying to understand his heart, his motivation, his capacity for sincere practice. After their conversation, Abbot Sozen smiled. "You may stay and train here if you wish. But I should tell you honestly what we offer. We don't practice the intense, long meditation sessions that some monasteries are known for. Our focus is on integrating awareness into daily work. We spend much of our time maintaining these grounds, cooking, cleaning, helping the village below. We believe practice happens in ordinary activity, not just on the meditation cushion." She paused, watching Ryota's face. "The monastery that turned you away is excellent for what they do. But their approach requires a certain background and temperament. You might not have been happy there, even if they had accepted you. Here, if you're willing to bring full attention to simple tasks, you may find what you're looking for." Ryota felt something shift inside him. This wasn't the prestigious monastery he had imagined. But Abbot Sozen's words resonated with something in him he hadn't fully recognized. He had always found peace in simple work, in the feel of a broom moving across wooden floors, in the care of tending a garden. "I would be honored to stay," Ryota said. Over the following months, Ryota discovered that Abbot Sozen had been right. The practice at this monastery suited him perfectly. During long hours of weeding, washing dishes, or chopping vegetables, he learned to maintain steady awareness. He found that his mind settled naturally when his hands were engaged in simple tasks. The meditation periods, though shorter than at famous monasteries, felt more accessible and genuine to his temperament. One day, about a year after his arrival, a traveling monk stopped at their monastery. Over the evening meal, this monk spoke about having trained at the prestigious monastery that had turned Ryota away. "The practice there is powerful," the monk said, "but extremely demanding. We sat for 10 hours a day with minimal sleep. The teaching was subtle and difficult to grasp. Many monks left within the first few months because the intensity was too much." He paused. "I learned a great deal, but I'm not sure it was the right place for me. I'm hoping to find somewhere more balanced." Ryota listened and felt a wave of understanding. The first monastery hadn't rejected him because he was inadequate. They had recognized, more clearly than he could at the time, that their approach wasn't suited to his nature. What he had interpreted as judgment of his worth was actually accurate assessment of fit. If that first teacher had accepted him out of politeness, Ryota might have struggled for months or years in an environment that didn't match his temperament. He might have concluded that he wasn't meant for serious practice at all. Instead, that initial rejection had set him on a path to finding the perfect place for his development. Years later, when Ryota had become a senior monk helping to receive new students, a young man arrived who reminded him of his younger self. The young man was earnest but uncertain, clearly hoping desperately to be accepted. After meeting with him, Ryota had to deliver difficult news. "Your sincerity is obvious. But I don't think our style of practice is what you need. You have a sharp, analytical mind that would benefit from a monastery that emphasizes study and debate. There's an excellent place 3 days south of here that would serve you much better." The young man's face fell, and Ryota recognized that look. The young man heard rejection, judgment, inadequacy. Ryota wished he could help him understand immediately what had taken him years to learn, that not right for here was completely different from not good enough. This story reveals something the Zen masters understood deeply about rejection and worth. When the first monastery turned Ryota away, the event itself was simple. They recognized their training style wouldn't serve him well. But Ryota's mind immediately created a painful story. He wasn't good enough, his training was inadequate, he was unsuited for serious practice. This story caused far more suffering than the simple fact of not being accepted. The teaching here isn't that rejection doesn't hurt, or that we shouldn't feel disappointed when something doesn't work out as we hoped. The feeling of disappointment is natural and human. The teaching is about recognizing the difference between the actual event and the story our mind creates about what it means. Each monastery, each teacher, each community has its own character, its own approach, its own needs. Some monasteries emphasize long meditation. Others focus on work practice. Some teach through intellectual study. Others through direct experience. These differences don't make one better or worse. They make them suited to different people with different temperaments and needs. When we're turned away from something we wanted, our mind often jumps to a conclusion: there's something wrong with us. We weren't smart enough, skilled enough, impressive enough, worthy enough. But this conclusion usually has nothing to do with reality. Most often, what seems like rejection is actually recognition that the fit isn't right, that our needs and their offerings don't align at this particular time. The first teacher who turned Ryota away was actually being kind, though Ryota couldn't see it then. If the teacher had accepted him out of politeness, knowing their approach wouldn't serve him well, that would have been the real cruelty. Instead, by being honest about the mismatch, the teacher freed Ryota to find the place where he could truly flourish. This understanding applies to many situations where we experience rejection. When someone doesn't choose to be in relationship with us, it's not usually because we're unworthy of love. It's because the particular combination of two people's histories, temperaments, needs, and circumstances doesn't create the right conditions. When we're not hired for a position we wanted, it's rarely because we lack value. More often, the specific needs of that organization at that moment aligned better with someone else's particular strengths. Recognizing this doesn't eliminate the disappointment of not getting what we hoped for, but it can prevent the additional layer of suffering that comes from making the rejection mean something about our fundamental worth. The disappointment is real and valid. The story that we're inadequate or unworthy is usually fiction. There's another dimension to this teaching that the Zen masters emphasized. Every person's preferences, every organization's needs come from a complex web of conditioning. The teachers at the first monastery preferred intense meditation because of their own training and understanding. The abbot at the second monastery valued work practice because of her background and insight. Neither preference was inherently superior. They were simply different expressions of practice shaped by different histories. When someone doesn't choose us, when we're not accepted somewhere we hope to be, we're not being judged against some universal standard of worth. We're simply not aligning with that particular person's or group's conditioned preferences in this particular moment. Their preferences say more about their history than about our value. In a different region, in the foothills where villages clustered along a wide river, there lived a young woman named Tama. From childhood, she had been drawn to the teachings of Zen Buddhism. She would listen raptly to traveling monks who occasionally passed through her village. She memorized the few teachings her family's small temple offered. At night, she would lie awake thinking about the nature of mind and awareness. She knew with certainty that she wanted to dedicate her life to practice and understanding. When Tama reached 18, she heard stories about a great master named Hakuin who lived 3 weeks' journey away. Master Hakuin was renowned throughout the region for his wisdom and his ability to guide students to profound realization. Monks would travel for months just to receive his teaching. He had written texts that were studied everywhere. People spoke of him with reverence, describing how his sharp questions could cut through years of confusion in a single exchange. This was exactly the teacher Tama wanted. Her parents were reluctant to let her go. "You're young," her father said. "How do you know this is truly your path?" "I've known since I was a child," Tama replied. "Every other possibility feels empty compared to this." Her mother worried about the journey. 3 weeks on foot for a young woman alone. "It's dangerous." "I'll be careful," Tama promised. "But I can't stay here knowing there's a teacher who could help me understand what I'm seeking." Finally, with their blessing, she set out. The walk took longer than expected. The mountain passes were steep and treacherous. She had to stop several times in villages to work for food and a place to sleep. She washed dishes at an inn. She helped harvest vegetables at a farm. Each delay made her more anxious that she would arrive too late, that the master might not accept new students, that her opportunity would somehow slip away. But finally, after nearly a month of travel, she arrived at the famous monastery. The grounds were more impressive than she had imagined. Hundreds of monks practiced there. The main gate was carved from massive timber. The meditation hall could hold more than 100 people. The library building had multiple stories. This was a serious place of practice, and Tama felt both intimidated and excited. This was where real understanding happened. This was where she would finally learn what she had been seeking all her life. She requested an audience with Master Hakuin, expecting to wait days or even weeks. To her surprise, she was granted a meeting the next morning. She barely slept that night in the guest quarters, rehearsing what she would say, how she would demonstrate her sincerity and dedication. She went over every teaching she had memorized, every insight she had gained from her limited study. Master Hakuin was elderly, but his presence filled the room. His eyes were sharp and clear. He gestured for Tama to sit and asked her directly why she had come. Tama poured out her story, her lifelong devotion to practice, her study of what little teaching was available in her village, her willingness to travel far from home, to leave her family, to dedicate herself completely to understanding. She tried to demonstrate her knowledge by speaking about the teachings she had memorized, quoting from texts, explaining her understanding of basic concepts. She wanted him to see how serious she was, how ready to dedicate herself completely to training under his guidance. The words tumbled out quickly, her nervousness making her speak faster than she intended. Master Hakuin listened without interruption. His face revealed nothing. When Tama finally finished, her throat dry from speaking, he sat in silence for what felt like a very long time. Then he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "Your dedication is clear. Your sincerity is obvious. but I am not the right teacher for you." Tama felt the words like a physical blow. The room seemed to tilt slightly. "Master, please. I will work harder than anyone. I will follow any instruction. I have traveled for a month to get here. I'll do whatever is needed." Hakuin shook his head slowly. "The distance you traveled and your willingness to work hard are not the question. I can see you have a subtle mind and a gentle spirit. You think carefully about things. You approach understanding gradually, building one insight upon another." He paused. "My teaching style is harsh and confrontational. I use koans that can seem like riddles, and I challenge students aggressively to break through their conceptual understanding. When students come to me with their careful explanations, I often tear those explanations apart to force them beyond conceptual thinking. This approach serves some students well. But for someone with your temperament, it would likely cause more confusion than clarity. You would spend your energy trying to defend your understanding rather than deepening it." "But you're the greatest master," Tama protested, tears starting in her eyes. "How can I learn properly from anyone else? Everyone speaks of your wisdom." "Greatest?" Hakuin raised an eyebrow. "I am effective for certain kinds of students. But there are many paths in Zen, many teaching styles. What makes me effective for some would make me harmful for others." He paused, his expression softening. "There is a teacher named Ryonen who lives in a small hermitage 2 days south of here. She teaches in a completely different way than I do. Her approach is gradual, gentle, focused on subtle awareness rather than dramatic breakthrough. She asks questions that help students discover insights for themselves rather than forcing breakthroughs. I think she would serve you much better than I ever could." "I've never heard of her," Tama said quietly, feeling foolish. "Not everyone needs to be famous to be wise," Hakuin replied. "Ryonen was one of my fellow students when we were young. She understood the teachings as deeply as anyone I've known. She simply chose a different path for sharing them." Tama left the monastery feeling devastated. She had built her entire vision of her practice around studying with Master Hakuin. To be turned away and directed to some teacher she had never even heard of felt like complete failure. She sat by the road outside the monastery gates for a long time, crying. She thought about returning home. Perhaps she had been foolish to think she could become a serious practitioner. Perhaps the journey had been a waste. Her parents had been right to worry. But she had nowhere else to go, and she had come too far to simply give up without even trying this other teacher. With heavy steps, she traveled south to find teacher Ryonen that Hakuin had mentioned. The hermitage, when she found it after 2 days of walking, was humble. Just a small building surrounded by vegetable gardens and a meditation hut built into the hillside. No impressive gates, no large halls, no library building. Only 3 other students lived there, all women around her age. Teacher Ryonen was a woman in her 50s, with a quiet, unhurried way of speaking. She wore a simple robe and had her hair tied back. Tama explained that Master Hakuin had sent her, trying to keep the disappointment out of her voice and failing. Ryonen smiled knowingly. "Hakuin and I trained together when we were young," she said. "We learned the same teachings but discovered completely different ways of sharing them. He breaks down walls with force. I help students find doorways they didn't know existed. Neither way is superior. They serve different people." She studied Tama's face. "You're disappointed to be here instead of at his monastery." "I'm sorry," Tama said, embarrassed. "I don't mean to be ungrateful." "Don't apologize for your honest feelings," Ryonen said. "You imagined your life would unfold one way, and now it seems to be unfolding differently. That disappointment is natural." Ryonen invited Tama to stay for a few weeks to see if the practice there suited her. Those weeks stretched into months, then years. Tama discovered that Ryonen's teaching style matched her nature perfectly. Instead of wrestling with paradoxical koans, they explored subtle aspects of awareness through careful observation. Ryonen would ask things like, "When you're washing dishes, where is your awareness?" Or, "What happens in the moment between hearing a sound and recognizing what made it?" These simple questions opened doors Tama hadn't known existed. Instead of intense confrontation that broke down her understanding, they practiced gentle inquiry that gradually revealed deeper layers. Ryonen taught through questions rather than answers. She would ask Tama to notice specific things during meditation or daily work, then ask what Tama had discovered. Each question opened new dimensions of awareness that Tama hadn't imagined existed. The practice felt natural, almost effortless, like water finding its own course rather than being forced through a channel. 5 years after her arrival, a young monk came to the hermitage seeking refuge. His name was Kenshin, and he looked exhausted and defeated. He had been studying with Master Hakuin, but found the practice there overwhelming and confusing. He felt like a failure for not being able to handle Hakuin's rigorous approach. "Every time I thought I understood something, he would challenge me so aggressively that I would doubt everything," Kenshin explained. "I felt like I was constantly defending myself rather than learning. I started to think, maybe I'm just not intelligent enough for serious practice." Tama listened to his story with deep understanding. She told him about her own journey, how she had initially seen being sent away from Hakuin as rejection and failure. Only later did she understand it as the greatest gift. Hakuin had recognized more clearly than she could at the time what kind of teaching would serve her best. "Master Hakuin is a great teacher," Tama said to the troubled young monk. "But great doesn't mean right for everyone. He recognized that his teaching style and my temperament weren't a good match. He cared enough to direct me somewhere I could truly learn, rather than accepting me out of politeness and watching me struggle. That's wisdom, not rejection." The young monk's face showed confusion, then slowly, understanding. "So, when he turned you away, he wasn't saying I wasn't good enough for his teaching," Tama finished. "He was saying his teaching wasn't right for me. Those are completely different things." Kenshin stayed at the hermitage and flourished under Ryonen's gentler approach. Watching him discover his own capacity for understanding helped Tama appreciate even more fully how different people need different paths. Years later, Tama became a teacher herself, helping students who came to her with their own stories of rejection and disappointment. She would tell them about Master Hakuin, about how being turned away from what she thought she wanted had led her to what she truly needed. She would remind them that teaching styles are like medicines. The most powerful medicine in the world is useless or even harmful if it's not the right medicine for your particular condition. This story illuminates another dimension of how we misunderstand rejection. Tama had created an entire fantasy about studying with the famous Master Hakuin. When that fantasy collapsed, she experienced it as personal failure. But Hakuin wasn't rejecting her worth or capability. He was recognizing with wisdom she didn't yet have, that his teaching approach wouldn't serve her particular mind and temperament well. The Zen masters understood something we often forget. There is no single right path, no universal best teacher, no one approach that serves everyone equally. What helps one person might confuse another. What awakens insight in one mind might create obstacles in a different mind. This isn't because one person is better or worse. It's because each person arrives with their own unique conditioning, temperament, and needs. When Hakuin directed Tama to Ryonen, he was offering wisdom and kindness, not rejection, though Tama couldn't recognize it at the time. We often make Tama's mistake. We decide that one particular path, person, or opportunity is exactly what we need. We invest our hopes in this specific outcome. Then, when it doesn't happen, when we're not chosen or welcomed in the way we imagined, we experience it as judgment of our worth. But what if the rejection is actually accurate recognition that this particular fit isn't right? The story also reveals how much suffering comes from our fantasies about how things should be. Tama had created an elaborate vision of her future with Master Hakuin. When reality didn't match her fantasy, she experienced it as failure. Only later could she see that reality had offered something better, something her limited imagination couldn't have predicted. Both Ryota and Tama eventually found exactly what they needed, but not in the form they expected. The rejection they experienced, which felt so personal and devastating at the time, was actually part of finding their right place. Not because rejection is magically good, but simply because their initial desires were based on limited understanding of what would truly serve their development. When we face rejection in our own lives, we might remember these stories. The person who doesn't choose us, the opportunity that doesn't work out, the door that closes in our face. These might feel like judgments of our worth. But more often, they're simply indications that the fit wasn't right, that circumstances don't align at this particular moment. As you rest more deeply now, you might notice where you carry stories about rejection, about not being chosen, about doors that closed. The events were simply moments when particular circumstances didn't align. The meaning that you weren't good enough, that something is wrong with you, that you're unworthy, that's the story that creates the lasting pain. Your worth isn't determined by who accepts or rejects you. Each person's preferences are shaped by their unique conditioning. Their choices reflect their circumstances, not your inherent value. The Zen masters observed something about human nature that becomes especially clear when we live closely with others. Each of us carries a set of preferences, habits, and ways of doing things that we rarely question. We think of them simply as the way things are done, or the sensible way, or the proper way. But these preferences aren't truth. They're conditioning. They're patterns we absorbed from our families, our teachers, our cultures, our past experiences. Living closely with another person holds up a mirror. When someone does things differently than we do, we feel friction. That friction isn't telling us they're wrong. It's revealing where we're rigidly attached to our own conditioning, where we've mistaken our particular way for the only reasonable way. At a small mountain temple lived two monks who were assigned to share a meditation hut. The temple was poor, with limited space, so monks often shared quarters. The head teacher thought these two would be well suited to live together. Both were sincere practitioners in their late 20s. Both had been at the temple for about 2 years. Both seemed steady and reasonable. The first monk was named Jiro. He had grown up in a merchant family where order was essential. His father kept meticulous records. His mother maintained their home with careful precision. Everything had its place. Jiro had brought this natural inclination toward order into his monastic practice. He found that when his living space was neat and organized, his mind settled more easily into meditation. When things were tidy, he could focus. When things were chaotic, his practice felt scattered. The second monk was named Kenzo. He had grown up in an artist's household where creativity flowed freely. His father was a calligrapher who worked in bursts of inspiration, sometimes practicing for hours, sometimes doing nothing for days. His mother was a weaver who kept her materials spread out where she could see them and be inspired. Kenzo had absorbed this looser way of being. He found that when he tried to maintain rigid order, he felt constricted and his practice became tense. When he could move more freely, leaving things where they naturally landed, his mind felt more spacious. For the first few weeks, both monks tried to be considerate. Jiro would come back to the hut to find Kenzo's meditation cushion slightly askew, his robe draped over a chair rather than hung properly, a teacup sitting on the windowsill instead of returned to the shelf. Each time, Jiro would feel a small irritation rise. He would quietly put things back in order. Surely Kenzo would notice and adjust his habits. Kenzo would arrive at the hut to find that Jiro had rearranged his things again. The book he'd been reading, which he'd left open on the table to mark his place, was now closed with a bookmark and returned to the shelf. His writing materials, which he'd spread out to work on later, were neatly stacked. Each time, Kenzo would feel a tightness in his chest. Why couldn't Jiro just leave things alone? He would take his materials back out. Surely Jiro would understand he was using them. Neither monk spoke about this friction directly. Both thought they were being reasonable and the other was being inconsiderate. Jiro thought to himself, it's just basic courtesy to keep shared space tidy. Why can't he see that? Kenzo thought to himself, it's unnecessary rigidity to constantly rearrange things that are being used. Why can't he relax? One morning, they both reached for the water bucket at the same time to wash. Jiro had a particular way of doing morning ablutions. He would fill the basin precisely halfway, wash his face with exactly 3 handfuls of water, then use the remaining water for his hands and feet. This was how he had been taught at his first temple, and it felt right to him. It was efficient and thorough. Kenzo's way was different. He would pour water freely, using what felt right in each moment. Sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on how he felt that morning. This was how he had learned, and it felt natural to him. "You use too much water," Jiro said, the words coming out more sharply than he intended. "You're too rigid about it," Kenzo replied, also more harshly than he meant. They stood there, both surprised by the sudden friction that had broken into the open. Neither spoke further, but the tension between them grew thicker. Over the following weeks, the small irritations multiplied. Jiro would wake early and move quietly, thinking this was considerate. But his quiet movements would wake Kenzo, who was a light sleeper. Kenzo would then stay up later at night, reading by candlelight, thinking he was being respectful by letting Jiro sleep first. But the flickering light would keep Jiro from falling deeply asleep. During meals, Jiro would finish eating and immediately clean his bowl, believing this was proper discipline. Kenzo would sit with his empty bowl for a while, reflecting on the meal, thinking this was proper mindfulness. Each thought the other's way showed a lack of understanding about practice. The head teacher, Master Suan, noticed the tension between them. He saw how they avoided each other during work periods. He heard the subtle sharpness in their voices when they did speak. One evening, he called them both to his quarters. "I understand you're having difficulties living together," Master Suan said. Both monks looked down, embarrassed. Jiro spoke first. "Master, I try to maintain proper order, but Kenzo is careless with shared space." "I'm not careless," Kenzo said, his voice tight. "Jiro is unnecessarily rigid. He can't let anything be." Master Suan nodded slowly. "Jiro, tell me about your morning washing. How do you do it?" Jiro explained his method, the precise amounts, the careful order. "This is how I was taught," he finished. "It's the correct way." "And Kenzo, how do you wash?" Kenzo described his more intuitive approach. "This is what feels natural," he said. "It's the right way to stay present." "I see," Master Suan said. "So you each believe you know the correct way." He let that sit in the silence for a moment. "Tell me, Jiro, before you came to your first temple, had you ever washed your face?" "Of course, Master." "And did you die from washing incorrectly?" Jiro felt his face grow warm. "No, Master." "Kenzo, at your first temple, did they teach any method for washing?" "Yes, Master. They taught me to use water freely, to trust my body's knowing." "So that became the right way?" Kenzo paused. "I suppose they taught me their way, and I thought it was just how it's done." "Both of you learned a way that worked well in your first environments," Master Suan said. "Jiro, your temple was in a mountain area where water was scarce. Careful use was necessary and became valued as discipline. Kenzo, your temple was beside a river with abundant water. Generous use felt natural and became valued as trust. Both approaches grew from their circumstances. Both can support practice. Neither is the truth." He looked at both monks. "The friction between you isn't because one of you is right and the other wrong. It's because you've each mistaken your conditioning for reality itself. You've taken what worked in one context and made it into a universal law." Over the following days, both monks sat with this teaching. Jiro began to notice how often he thought, "This is the right way," without questioning where that idea came from. He saw how his preference for order, which genuinely helped his practice, had hardened into a belief that disorder was wrong for everyone. Kenzo began to notice how he had taken his natural looseness, which genuinely served his practice, and elevated it into a principle that rigidity was always bad. He had been just as attached to his way as Jiro was to his. One evening, Jiro found Kenzo's teacup on the windowsill again. Instead of his usual irritation, he felt curious. He asked, "Why do you leave your cup there?" Kenzo looked up, surprised by the genuine question rather than silent judgment. "I like to have tea while watching the evening light. If I put the cup away, I have to get it out again. It's simpler to leave it ready." "That makes sense," Jiro said, and realized he meant it. It wasn't his way, but he could see how it worked for Kenzo. A few days later, Kenzo noticed Jiro carefully organizing the meditation cushions before sitting. Instead of his usual resentment about rigidity, he asked, "Does arranging things help you settle?" "Yes," Jiro said, grateful to be asked. "When the outer space is ordered, my mind feels more ready to sit. I know it's not necessary, but it helps me." "That makes sense," Kenzo said, and found he meant it. It wasn't his way, but he could see how it served Jiro. Gradually, the friction between them eased. Not because either changed their basic habits, but because they stopped insisting their way was the way. Jiro continued to keep his area neat. Kenzo continued to live more loosely. But now Jiro could see Kenzo's cup on the windowsill without tension, recognizing it as Kenzo's way rather than a failure to do things correctly. And Kenzo could see Jiro arranging cushions without judgment, recognizing it as what helped Jiro rather than unnecessary rigidity. The hut still looked like it housed two people with different habits. But the atmosphere inside had completely changed. Where there had been silent friction, now there was spaciousness. Both monks could practice according to their nature without the exhausting weight of believing the other should change. This story reveals what the Zen masters understood about conditioning and conflict. Both Jiro and Kenzo had learned approaches that genuinely worked for them. Jiro's order did help his practice settle. Kenzo's looseness did help his practice stay fluid. Neither was wrong about what served their own temperament. The problem wasn't their different approaches. The problem was the unconscious belief that what worked for each of them was universally correct. Jiro had absorbed from his merchant family and his first temple that order equals discipline equals proper practice. He never questioned this. It simply felt like obvious truth. Kenzo had absorbed from his artist family and his first temple that looseness equals trust equals proper practice. He never questioned this either. Living closely together forced both monks to confront their assumptions. When we live alone or only with people who share our conditioning, we rarely see that our preferences are just preferences. They seem like simple common sense. But when someone we respect does things completely differently, we face a choice. We can insist they're wrong and we're right. Or we can begin to question whether our way is absolute truth. Master Soen's teaching pointed to something subtle. He didn't say all ways are equally effective. Water conservation made genuine sense in a mountain temple with limited water. Generous use made genuine sense beside an abundant river. Context matters. What serves practice in one situation might not serve it in another. But both monks had taken their contextual learning and hardened it into rigid principle. This is what our minds do. We learn something that works, and without noticing, we begin to think it's the only thing that works. We mistake our particular conditioning for universal law. The peace that emerged between Jiro and Kenzo didn't come from one of them being proven right. It came from both of them recognizing their preferences as preferences rather than truth. Jiro could continue to value order without needing Kenzo to value it. Kenzo could continue to value looseness without needing Jiro to value it. The attachment to their way being the way had dissolved. This is the freedom the Zen masters pointed toward. Not freedom from having preferences or habits, but freedom from being enslaved by the belief that our preferences are objective reality. We can use what works for us without needing to make it into a universal principle that everyone else must follow. In a different monastery, in a valley known for its hot springs, a young monk named Takeo came to study with Master Etsuko. Takeo had trained for 3 years at a large, prestigious monastery where discipline was rigorous and routines were strict. He had learned to wake before dawn, to sit in meditation for long periods without moving, to eat his meals in formal silence, to work with intense focus. This training had been valuable. It had taught him dedication and concentration. When Takeo arrived at Master Etsuko's small temple, he expected to continue this rigorous approach. After all, he thought, serious practice required serious discipline. His first teacher had made this clear. The great masters of the past had practiced this way. It was obviously the correct path. But Master Etsuko's temple was different. She woke with the sun rather than before it. Her meditation periods were shorter but more frequent throughout the day. She would sometimes stop in the middle of a task to sit for a few minutes, then return to work. Meals were simple but not formal. She would often hum quietly while working. Her whole approach felt casual to Takeo, almost careless. At first, Takeo tried to maintain his rigorous schedule within this looser environment. He would wake in the dark while Master Etsuko still slept. He would sit in the meditation hall alone, holding his posture perfectly still even as his legs ached. He would eat his meals in formal silence even as his teacher ate naturally and sometimes spoke between bites. Master Etsuko noticed but said nothing. She continued her own practice in her own way. She seemed content, even joyful in her approach. This confused Takeo. How could someone practice so casually and still be considered a master? Shouldn't discipline require more rigor? One morning, Takeo came to the meditation hall extra early, determined to demonstrate proper dedication. He found Master Etsuko already there, sitting quietly in the pre-dawn darkness. But she wasn't in formal meditation posture. She was sitting comfortably, almost casually, her eyes soft and open, watching the first light begin to touch the mountains. Takeo felt a flash of judgment. This wasn't proper zazen. Where was the straight spine, the precise hand position, the focused inward attention? He sat down in his perfect posture and closed his eyes, showing her the correct way. After about an hour, as the sun fully rose, Master Etsuko stood and stretched. Takeo remained sitting, determined to complete another hour at least. That's what serious practitioners did. "Takeo," Master Etsuko said gently, "come help me prepare breakfast." Takeo felt resistance rise in him. Serious practitioners sat for long periods. But she was his teacher, so he stood, his legs stiff and painful from the rigid posture, and followed her to the kitchen. As they worked together, Master Etsuko asked, "How was your sitting this morning?" "Fine, Master," Takeo said, though in truth his mind had been filled with judgments about her casual posture and his own determination to sit correctly. "What did you notice during your meditation?" Takeo paused. What had he noticed? He had been so focused on maintaining perfect form, on sitting longer than his teacher, on demonstrating proper practice, that he hadn't really noticed anything beyond his aching legs and his thoughts about correct and incorrect practice. "I noticed my posture," he said finally. Master Etsuko smiled slightly. "And what did I notice?" Takeo didn't know how to answer. "I noticed the light changing," she said, washing rice with easy movements. "I noticed the birds beginning their morning songs. I noticed my breath naturally deepening as the day began. I noticed the temperature shift as the sun touched the valley. I noticed my body naturally wanting to stretch and move. She looked at him kindly. We were both sitting in that hall. But I wonder if we were doing the same practice. Over the following weeks, Master Etsuko gave Takeo various tasks. She would ask him to weed the garden, but when he attacked the work with intense focus, working until he was exhausted, she would stop him. "Takeo, are you working or fighting?" She would ask him to help prepare meals, but when he cooked with rigid attention to every detail, measuring everything precisely, she would ask, "Are you cooking with love or with rules?" She would sit with him in the meditation hall, but when he held himself painfully still, she would gently ask, "Are you sitting with awareness or with force?" Takeo found these questions frustrating. He was doing everything correctly, the way he had been taught. Why did she keep questioning his approach? He began to feel resentful. Had he come all this way to study with a teacher who didn't even understand proper discipline? One evening, after Takeo had spent the entire day working with fierce intensity in the garden, he came inside exhausted and irritable. Master Etsuko was sitting quietly, mending a robe, humming softly. "Master," Takeo said, unable to contain his frustration any longer, "I don't understand your teaching." At my first monastery, we learned that serious practice requires discipline, rigor, intensity. We pushed ourselves beyond comfort. We followed strict schedules. That's how the great masters practiced. But you seem so casual. How can this lead to genuine understanding? Master Etsuko set down her mending and looked at him with great kindness. "Tell me about your first teacher." Takeo described Master Hakuin, a stern man who had trained at the most demanding monasteries. He had survived enormous hardship and believed this hardship was essential to break through. "And did your practice under his guidance serve you?" "Yes," Takeo said. "I learned concentration and dedication." "Then he was a good teacher for you at that time," Master Etsuko said. "Tell me, what was Master Hakuin's temperament?" Takeo thought. "He was very strong, willed, determined. He had a forceful nature. And you?" "I suppose I'm similar. I've always pushed myself hard." "Yes," Master Etsuko said. "And that approach worked well for your nature at that stage. The intensity matched your inner intensity. The discipline channeled your natural determination." She paused. "But tell me, Takeo, in these weeks here, has forcing yourself into rigid practice brought you peace, or has it brought you tension?" Takeo had to admit that he felt more tense, more judgmental, more rigid than he had felt in a long time. "My temperament is different from Master Hakuin's," Etsuko continued. "I'm naturally gentle. Forcing myself into harsh discipline doesn't deepen my practice, it creates war inside me. So I learn to practice in a way that suits my nature. Awareness can be gentle. Discipline doesn't always mean force." She picked up her mending again. "You came here thinking there was one correct way to practice, the way you learned. But there are many authentic paths. What serves a naturally forceful person might harm a naturally gentle person. What helps someone who needs to build concentration might hinder someone who needs to soften their rigidity." "But Master," Takeo protested, "shouldn't we push beyond our comfort? Isn't that how we grow?" "There's a difference between challenging yourself and attacking yourself," Etsuko said. Your practice here has been violent. You're not challenging yourself to grow, you're forcing yourself to match an idea of what practice should look like. That idea came from your conditioning, from your first teacher's conditioning, from a whole lineage of people with similar temperaments. It's not wrong, but it's also not the only way. She looked at him directly. I didn't ask you to abandon discipline. I asked you to find what discipline means for you now, in this body, with this mind, at this stage of practice. Your way of sitting with rigid intensity might have been perfect for you 2 years ago. But is it perfect for you now? Or are you just repeating a pattern because you've decided it's the correct pattern? That night, Takeo couldn't sleep. He lay in his small room, feeling everything Master Etsuko had said turning over in his mind. He had been so sure he knew the right way to practice. He had been so certain that his teacher's casual approach was inferior. But was that true? Or had he just been clinging to his conditioning, defending his way as the way? The next morning, instead of forcing himself awake before dawn, Takeo let himself wake naturally with the light. Instead of sitting in rigid posture, he tried sitting as Master Etsuko did, with gentle attention rather than force. Instead of working in the garden with fierce intensity, he worked with steady presence, stopping when his body needed rest. Everything felt strange, almost wrong. His mind kept insisting this wasn't real practice. But he noticed something. Without the constant force he usually applied to himself, he could actually feel his experience more clearly. He could notice what his body needed. He could sense when his mind was truly concentrated and when it was just tense. Over the following months, Takeo began to understand what Master Etsuko had been teaching. His first monastery's approach wasn't wrong. It had served him well at that stage. But he had taken that particular approach and made it into an absolute rule. He had thought, "This is how I learned to practice," meant, "This is how everyone must practice," and even, "This is how I must always practice." Living closely with Master Etsuko had forced him to confront his rigidity. Her different approach had irritated him precisely because it challenged his certainty. But that irritation was a gift. It showed him where he was clinging, where he had mistaken his particular conditioning for universal truth. A year later, a new student arrived, young and full of enthusiasm. Takeo watched as this student tried to practice exactly as Master Etsuko did, imitating her gentle style, even though the student's natural temperament was more like Takeo's had been, forceful and intense. Takeo smiled, recognizing what was happening. The new student was making the same mistake, just in reverse. Thinking Master Etsuko's way was the right way simply because she was the teacher here. "Master," Takeo asked one evening, "should I say something to the new student?" "What would you say?" "That he's trying to practice in a way that doesn't match his nature. That he's imitating your gentleness instead of finding his own path." Master Etsuko laughed quietly. "You've learned the teaching?" "Yes, speak with him. Help him see that my way is my way, not the way. Just as your old way was your way then, not the way for all time." This second story deepens the teaching about conditioning and its hold on us. Takeo came to Master Etsuko carrying not just preferences, but deeply held beliefs about what constitutes legitimate practice. He had absorbed from his first teacher that rigor equals seriousness, that discipline means force, that casual ease indicates lack of genuine commitment. These beliefs felt like obvious truth to Takeo. He wasn't consciously thinking, "This is just my opinion." He thought he was observing objective reality. When he saw Master Etsuko practicing differently, his mind immediately labeled her approach as inferior, casual, not serious enough. This is how conditioning works. It doesn't feel like conditioning. It feels like seeing clearly. Our particular way of understanding things seems like the natural, correct, obvious way. Other approaches seem wrong or confused or inadequate. Living with Master Etsuko created unavoidable friction for Takeo. He couldn't dismiss her as someone who didn't understand practice. She was clearly his superior in understanding. But her whole approach contradicted everything he thought he knew. This created a crisis that ultimately opened him to questioning his assumptions. The teaching here isn't that all approaches are equally effective. Master Etsuko explicitly said that Takeo's intense approach had served him well at an earlier stage with his first teacher. Different temperaments often need different approaches. Someone naturally loose might benefit from learning discipline. Someone naturally rigid might benefit from learning gentleness. But Takeo had taken what worked for his temperament at one stage and hardened it into absolute truth. He had stopped asking, "What serves practice now?" and started insisting, "This is how practice must be done." His attachment wasn't to a method that worked. His attachment was to the belief that his method was the only legitimate method. When he began to release this attachment, something shifted. He could still use intense practice when it served him, but he could also practice gently when that served him better. He had gained flexibility, responsiveness, freedom. He was no longer enslaved by his conditioning, even as he could still draw on what that conditioning had taught him. This is what the Zen masters pointed toward when they spoke of non-attachment. Not non-attachment to things or even to methods, but non-attachment to our concepts about what must be true. When we hold our ideas lightly, recognizing them as conditioned responses rather than ultimate reality, a natural ease emerges. We can still have preferences and use approaches that work for us. But we're no longer imprisoned by the need to defend these as universally correct. The peace that both stories reveal doesn't come from everyone practicing the same way or living according to the same preferences. It comes from each person recognizing their own conditioning as conditioning. When Jiro and Kenzo stopped insisting their way was the way, they could live together peacefully while remaining different. When Takeo stopped defending his intensive approach as the only legitimate path, he could appreciate both his teacher's gentleness and his own capacity for intensity. This understanding offers freedom for those of us who live closely with others or who encounter approaches different from our own. The friction we feel when someone does things differently isn't usually because they're wrong. It's revealing where we're attached to our particular conditioning, where we've mistaken our way for the way. When we recognize this, the friction itself becomes useful. Instead of proving the other person wrong, it shows us where we're holding rigidly to our concepts. Each moment of irritation at someone's different approach is an opportunity to question whether our preference is truth or just conditioning. The natural peace that emerges from this understanding is quiet but profound. We can still prefer our own way. We can still use approaches that work for our temperament. But we're no longer burdened by the need to make our way into a universal law. We're no longer exhausted by the work of defending our conditioning against different conditioning. We can simply be as we are, while letting others be as they are, recognizing that various paths can lead to the same understanding. The Zen masters noticed something curious about human suffering. We can have genuine abundance, yet feel empty. We can possess real skills, yet feel inadequate. We can live good lives, yet feel we're falling short. This suffering doesn't come from what we actually have or lack. It comes from a mental habit so automatic we rarely notice it. We measure ourselves against others. We compare our lives to their lives. And in that comparison, we create our own dissatisfaction. At a monastery known throughout the province for its gardens and calligraphy, two monks practiced side by side. Both had arrived at the monastery in the same year. Both had trained under the same teachers. Both showed dedication to their practice. They had been friends since their arrival, sharing meals and working together in the gardens. The first monk was named Shozen. He had a natural warmth that drew people to him. When he spoke about the teachings, something in his words seemed to reach people's hearts. Visitors to the monastery would often seek him out for guidance. His calligraphy had a flowing quality that people found beautiful. Other monks would gather to watch when he practiced his brushwork. The second monk was named Kenso. He was quieter, more reserved. His understanding of the teachings was deep, but he expressed himself more carefully with fewer words. His calligraphy was precise and correct, but it lacked the spontaneous grace that made Shozen's work so admired. Visitors rarely asked specifically for him. When senior monks needed someone to greet guests or give talks, they usually chose Shozen. For the first few years, Kenso didn't pay much attention to these differences. He and Shozen were friends. He appreciated Shozen's gifts. But gradually, something began to shift. Small moments started to accumulate. A visiting scholar would ask to speak with Shozen about the sutras. A wealthy patron would commission calligraphy from Shozen. The abbot would send Shozen to represent the monastery at a gathering. Each time, Kenso would feel a small tightness in his chest. He would tell himself it didn't matter. He would remind himself that recognition wasn't important. But the feeling persisted and slowly grew stronger. One afternoon, a group of visitors came to the monastery hoping to receive teaching. The abbot asked Shozen to meet with them. As Kenso worked alone in the garden, he could hear laughter and animated conversation from the guest hall where Shozen was speaking. The visitors sounded engaged, moved, grateful. Kenso felt something dark rise in him. Why was Shozen always chosen? Weren't they equally trained? Hadn't they both studied just as diligently? That evening at dinner, one of the visitors approached Kenso. "Your friend Shozen is a remarkable teacher," the visitor said warmly. "You must feel fortunate to practice alongside someone with such gift for expressing the Dharma." Kenso smiled and nodded, but inside he felt a sharp pain. Fortunate to practice alongside Shozen? As if Shozen was the real practitioner and Kenso was just there. Just fortunate to be near someone actually worthy of attention. Over the following weeks, Kenso became increasingly aware of the ways Shozen received recognition while he did not. When visitors praised the monastery's beautiful calligraphy, they meant Shozen's work. When monks spoke admiringly of someone's understanding, they were talking about Shozen. Even in casual moments, Kenso noticed how others gravitated towards Shozen, how conversations became more animated when Shozen joined them. Kenso tried to push these observations away. He knew comparison was problematic. He knew attachment to recognition was a trap. But knowing this didn't stop the feelings from arising. If anything, feeling jealous made him feel worse, because now he was failing at practice too. Not only was he less gifted than Shozen, he was also more petty, more caught up in ego. One morning, Kenso was working in the garden when the abbot, Master Daido, came to sit nearby. They worked in silence for a while, Kenso weeding around the stone path, the master simply sitting on a bench watching the morning light. After some time, Master Daido spoke. "Kenso, I've noticed something troubling in you lately. A heaviness. Would you like to speak about it?" Kenzo felt his face grow warm. He didn't want to admit what he was feeling. It seemed so small and petty. But the master waited patiently, and finally, Kenzo found words. "Master, I'm struggling with something I'm ashamed of. I feel diminished. Shozen receives so much recognition, so much appreciation. Visitors seek him out. You choose him for important tasks. His calligraphy is admired while mine is merely adequate. I know I shouldn't care about these things. I know recognition is empty, but I can't seem to stop feeling this way." Master Daido nodded slowly. "You feel jealous of Shozen?" "Yes," Kenso admitted quietly. "And I feel ashamed of feeling jealous. So now I'm failing twice. Once by caring about recognition, and again by feeling resentment toward my friend." "Tell me," the master said, "do you feel jealous of the emperor?" Kenso looked up, confused. "The emperor? No, of course not." "Why not?" "He has far more recognition than Shozen. People bow before him. His words carry weight throughout the land. He lives in great comfort. Shouldn't you be more jealous of him than of Shozen?" "That's different," Kenso said. "The emperor is separate. His life and mine have nothing to do with each other." "Ah," Master Daido said. "So you only feel jealous of someone close to you, someone whose path seems similar to yours." "I suppose so. And do you feel jealous of the novice who arrived last month, the one who can barely sit through a meditation session without fidgeting?" "No," Kenso said. "Why not?" "He's also a monk here, also practicing alongside you." Kenso thought about this. "Because he's just beginning. It would be strange to compare myself to someone so new." "So you only compare yourself to people who seem similar enough to you, but slightly ahead. Not to the emperor who is far ahead, and not to the novice who is far behind. Only to Shozen, who arrived when you did and trained as you did, but now receives recognition you don't receive." Kenso sat with this observation. He had never thought about it quite this way before. Master Daido continued, his voice gentle. "This comparing mind is arbitrary. You've chosen one particular person and one particular measure and one particular time frame. You could compare yourself to Shozen's calligraphy, but not to his struggles with formal study, which you know he finds difficult. You could compare your situation now to Shozen's now, but not to where you both were 5 years ago or where you both might be 5 years from now. The comparing mind is very selective about what it notices. But the recognition he receives is real," Kenso said. "It's not just in my mind. People truly do seek him out more, value his teaching more." "That's true," the master agreed. "Shozen has certain gifts that draw recognition in this particular community at this particular time. But tell me, does that recognition make his morning rice taste better than yours? Does it make his breath move more freely? Does it bring him closer to understanding his own nature?" Kenso was quiet. "You're not suffering because Shozen receives recognition," Master Daido said. You're suffering because your mind is telling you a story. The story says, if Shozen is valued more, I am valued less. If Shozen is chosen, I am rejected. If Shozen's gifts are acknowledged, mine are inadequate. But these are stories, not truth. Shozen's recognition doesn't diminish you. It simply exists alongside you. But how do I stop feeling this way? Kenso asked. Not by trying to stop feeling, the master replied, but by seeing clearly. Each time the jealousy arises, notice what your mind is doing. Notice how it selects Shozen specifically to compare to. Notice how it focuses on recognition specifically as the measure. Notice how it creates a story that you're failing. And ask yourself, is this story true, or is it just one way of seeing things? Over the following months, Kenso practiced this noticing. Each time he felt that familiar tightness when Shozen was praised or chosen, he would pause. He would notice his mind creating a comparison. He would observe how arbitrary that comparison was. He compared himself to Shozen, but not to countless other monks. He focused on public recognition, but not on private understanding. He measured himself at this moment, but not across the arc of a whole life. Slowly, something began to shift. The jealousy still arose, but it no longer felt so solid, so true. He could see it as a mental habit rather than reality itself. And in seeing it clearly, its power over him loosened. One day, a group of visitors came specifically requesting calligraphy from Shozen. Kenso felt the old tightness begin to rise. But then he noticed what his mind was doing. It was creating a story. Shozen is valued, therefore I am not valued. But when he looked directly at this story, he could see it was just a story. Shozen being valued and Kenso being valued weren't opposites. They could both be true, or neither could be true. Or the whole framework of being valued or not valued might be irrelevant to genuine practice. In that moment, Kenso felt a spaciousness open. The jealousy was there, but it wasn't defining his experience. He could acknowledge Shozen's gifts without it diminishing his own worth. Because his worth wasn't actually related to how he compared to Shozen. That comparison was just something his mind was doing, not reality itself. Years later, when Kenso had become a senior teacher himself, a young monk came to him struggling with jealousy toward another student. Kenso listened with deep understanding and told him about his own experience with Shozen. The suffering doesn't come from the other person's recognition, Kenso said. It comes from the comparing mind. When you see this clearly, the comparison loses its power. Not because you've convinced yourself it doesn't matter, but because you've seen through the arbitrary nature of comparison itself. This story reveals what the Zen masters understood about jealousy and comparison. Kenso's suffering didn't come from any actual lack in his life or practice. He had food, shelter, genuine practice, sincere understanding. His suffering came entirely from the mental habit of measuring himself against Shozen. Master Daido's questions revealed how arbitrary this comparison was. Kenso didn't compare himself to everyone, just to someone similar enough to seem relevant, but different enough to create painful contrast. He didn't compare across all dimensions, just the particular dimensions where he felt deficient. The comparing mind is selective, creating a very particular kind of suffering by choosing very particular comparisons. The teaching here isn't that recognition doesn't exist or that Shozen's gifts weren't real. In conventional reality, Some people do receive more recognition than others. Some have gifts that draw attention. Some are chosen for certain roles. These are facts. But the suffering comes from the story we create about what these facts mean. The story that says another person's recognition diminishes our worth. The story that says we're failing because someone else is succeeding. When Kenso began to see comparison as a mental habit rather than reality itself, something shifted. He didn't have to convince himself that recognition didn't matter or that he was secretly just as good as Shozen. He simply saw that the comparing mind was creating a particular kind of suffering through a particular kind of selective attention. And in seeing this clearly, the comparison lost its power to define his experience. The peace that emerged wasn't dependent on Kenso receiving equal recognition or on Shozen receiving less. It came from recognizing that his worth existed independent of any comparison. Shozen's gifts and recognition could exist without diminishing Kenso. This wasn't a philosophical position Kenso adopted. It was a direct seeing through the illusion that comparison was showing him truth rather than just creating suffering. At another monastery, deeper in the mountains, a group of students trained together under Master Ingen. Among them were two young monks who had arrived within weeks of each other. The first was named Hakuro. He seemed to grasp teachings quickly. When Master Ingen posed questions during study sessions, Hakuro often understood immediately. His meditation appeared natural and deep. Senior monks would sometimes comment on his progress approvingly. The second student was named Yoten. He worked just as diligently as Hakuro, perhaps even more so. He would stay up late studying texts. He would sit in meditation long after others had gone to sleep. But understanding came more slowly to him. When Master Ingen asked questions, Yoten would puzzle over them for days before glimpsing possible answers. His meditation felt laborious, his mind restless despite his sincere effort. In the beginning, Yoten simply focused on his own practice. He was grateful to be at the monastery, grateful for the teachings, absorbed in his own efforts. But gradually he became aware of Hakuro's rapid progress. He noticed how Master Ingen's eyes would light up when Hakuro offered an insight. He heard other students speaking admiringly about Hakuro's natural aptitude. Yoten tried to be happy for his friend. He told himself that Hakuro's progress was wonderful, that it didn't affect his own path. But a small voice in his mind kept asking, "Why can't I grasp things as quickly? What's wrong with me? Am I less capable, less intelligent, less suited for this practice?" During group meditation, Yoten would sometimes open his eyes slightly and glance at Hakuro. Hakuro always sat perfectly still, his face serene, clearly absorbed in deep concentration. Meanwhile, Yoten's legs would ache, his mind would wander, his posture would gradually slump despite his best efforts. Even in meditation, Hakuro seemed to be succeeding while Yoten was struggling. One afternoon, Master Ingen announced that Hakuro had been given permission to begin working with advanced koans, practices usually reserved for students who had trained for many years. Yoten felt his heart sink. He had been at the monastery just as long as Hakuro. They had started together. Why was Hakuro advancing while he remained at basic levels? That night, Yoten couldn't sleep. He lay in his small room feeling a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. Sadness, frustration, shame, and underneath it all, a growing conviction that he simply wasn't good enough for this path. Perhaps some people were naturally suited for Zen practice and others weren't. Perhaps he should accept that he was in the second category. The next morning, Jotun approached Master Ingen. "Master, I need to speak with you about leaving the monastery." Master Ingen gestured for him to sit. "Why would you leave?" "I don't think I'm suited for this practice," Jotun said, the words tumbling out. "I try as hard as I can, but understanding doesn't come. I meditate sincerely, but my mind stays restless. Other students, like Hakuro, seem to progress naturally while I struggle with everything. Perhaps my capacity is limited. Perhaps I should accept that and pursue a simpler life." Master Ingen listened quietly. When Jotun finished, the teacher asked a simple question. "Why are you comparing yourself to Hakuro?" The question caught Jotun off guard. "Because we started at the same time. We're at the same stage of life. It seems natural to notice his progress compared to mine." "Natural," Master Ingen repeated. "Tell me, do you compare your progress to that of Master Banzan, the renowned teacher who lives in the capital?" "No, of course not. He's a great master." "Why not?" "He also practices Zen. Shouldn't you measure yourself against him?" "That would be ridiculous. He's been practicing for 40 years. He's achieved deep realization. So you only compare yourself to people at roughly your same stage," Master Ingen observed. "But tell me, there's a novice who arrived last month who can barely sit still for 10 minutes. Do you compare yourself to him?" "No," Jotun said. "Why not?" "Because he's just beginning." "Ah," Master Ingen said. "So you compare yourself only to people who are similar enough to seem relevant, but ahead enough to make you feel inadequate. That's a very specific choice your mind is making." Jotun sat with this. "And why do you compare on the dimension of speed?" The master continued. "Why not compare on the dimension of effort? You work harder than most students here. Why not compare on sincerity? Your dedication is genuine and deep. Why not compare on humility? You're less arrogant than many who progress quickly. I suppose I focus on the areas where I'm lacking," Jotun said quietly. "Yes," Master Ingen said. "The comparing mind is very selective. It chooses particular people and particular measures specifically to create suffering. You could compare yourself to students who progress more slowly and feel superior. You could compare yourself across dimensions where you excel and feel satisfied. But instead, your mind chooses the exact comparison that creates the most pain." He paused, then asked, "Have you noticed that Hakuro struggles with something you don't?" Jotun looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "Hakuro grasps concepts quickly, yes. But he has difficulty with simple presence. His mind is always jumping ahead, always grasping for the next insight. During work practice, he's often distracted, thinking about teachings rather than being present to his tasks. You, on the other hand, bring genuine presence to whatever you're doing. Your difficulty with concepts comes partly from the fact that you're actually here in your experience rather than lost in abstraction." This had never occurred to Jotun. He had always seen Hakuro's quick understanding as simply better, not as a different quality with its own limitations. "There's no single path through this practice," Master Ingen continued. "Some people's understanding unfolds quickly but remains somewhat superficial. Others' understanding develops slowly but roots deeply. Some people excel at meditation but struggle with compassion. Others overflow with compassion but find meditation difficult. Each person walks their own path according to their own nature. But Hakuro is advancing to higher levels, Yoten protested. Higher, Master Ingen repeated. According to what measure? He's working with different practices now, yes. But different isn't higher or better. It's simply different. You're comparing your inside experience to his outside appearance and calling it truth. Over the following weeks, Yoten tried to practice what Master Ingen had pointed toward. Each time he noticed himself comparing to Hakuro, he would pause. He would observe how his mind selected Hakuro specifically, how it focused on speed of understanding specifically, how it created a story that Hakuro's path was better than his own path. Gradually, Yoten began to see the comparing mind as a mental habit rather than perception of reality. He still noticed Hakuro's quick understanding, but he stopped making it mean something about his own worth or capacity. They were simply two people with different qualities walking different paths. One day, several months later, Hakuro came to Yoten looking troubled. "Can I talk with you?" he asked. They walked together in the garden. Hakuro was quiet for a while, then finally spoke. "I've been advancing through different practices, working with complex koans, receiving recognition from the master. But lately I've been feeling empty, like I'm collecting understandings without actually transforming. I watch you during work practice, how present you are, how genuine. I watch you with new students, how patient and kind. And I wonder if I've been grasping at progress while missing something essential." Yoten felt something shift in him. Hakuro, whom he had envied for his rapid advancement, was struggling in ways Yoten hadn't imagined. The comparing mind had created such a simple story. Hakuro was succeeding, Yoten was failing. But the reality was far more complex. Each of them had gifts and struggles invisible to the other. Years later, both monks were still at the monastery, both now teaching students themselves. Hakuro had indeed achieved deep insight, but continued to work on presence and simplicity. Yoten had developed profound understanding through his patient, grounded approach. They were different teachers serving different students, each valuable in their own way. When young students came to Yoten struggling with comparison, he would tell them about his experience with Hakuro. "The suffering came from believing my mind's story about his progress and my failure. When I saw that story as just a story, not reality, the suffering dissolved. Not because I convinced myself I was just as good as Hakuro, but because I saw that the comparison itself was creating the problem, not the difference in our paths." This second story deepens the teaching about comparison. Yoten's suffering came entirely from measuring his path against Hakuro's. He had actual practice, sincere dedication, real development. But because it looked different from Hakuro's more visible progress, the comparing mind created a story of inadequacy. Master Ingen's questions revealed the arbitrary nature of comparison. Yoten compared himself only to Hakuro, not to masters far ahead or novices far behind. He compared only on dimensions where he felt deficient, not on dimensions where he excelled. This selective comparison created maximum suffering. The teaching isn't that all paths are equally effective or that differences don't exist. Hakuro did grasp concepts more quickly. But the comparing mind took this fact and created fiction around it. Fiction that speed of understanding equals better practice. Fiction that visible progress equals genuine development. Fiction that Yoten's slower, deeper approach was inferior to Hakuro's quicker, more conceptual approach. When Joten began to see through these stories, freedom emerged. Not because his path suddenly matched Hakuro's, but because he stopped needing his path to match anyone's. He could acknowledge Hakuro's gifts without it diminishing his own. He could recognize his own struggles without making them mean he was failing. The revelation that Hakuro was struggling with presence and depth, areas where Joten naturally excelled, showed how incomplete the comparing mind's view had been. Each person's path contains both gifts and challenges invisible to others. The comparing mind always creates an oversimplified story, seeing only selected fragments and calling them the whole truth. Both stories point to the same insight. Comparison creates suffering not because differences don't exist, but because the comparing mind takes real differences and creates fictional hierarchies. It chooses particular people, particular measures, particular moments to create a story about our inadequacy. When we see this mental habit clearly, when we recognize comparison as something the mind does rather than truth about reality, a natural freedom emerges. This freedom doesn't require us to achieve what others have achieved or to convince ourselves we're equal in all ways. It comes from recognizing that worth isn't determined by comparison. Your path is your path. Another person's path is their path. Both can unfold according to their own nature without one diminishing the other. The peace that emerges from this understanding is quiet but profound. You can acknowledge others' gifts without it threatening your worth. You can recognize your own struggles without making them mean you're failing. The comparing mind loses its power, not because you've won some competition, but because you've seen through the illusion that comparison shows truth rather than just creating suffering. The Zen masters observed a peculiar habit of the human mind. We have a tendency to place our peace somewhere in the future. We tell ourselves that we'll be content after we achieve this goal, master that skill, reach this milestone. We carry an unconscious belief that peace is something we must earn through accomplishment, something that will arrive after we've met certain conditions. But this habit of postponement creates a problem. No matter what we achieve, the mind simply moves the target forward. Peace remains always just ahead, always conditional, always waiting for one more thing. At a monastery known for its rigorous training, a young monk named Tenshin practiced with great dedication. He had arrived at the monastery 3 years earlier, filled with aspiration. He wanted to master meditation, understand the deepest teachings, and experience the peace that enlightened masters seemed to embody. Tenshin threw himself into practice with intensity. During his first year, he struggled with basic meditation. His mind wandered constantly. His body ached during long sitting periods. Other monks seemed to settle into stillness while he fought with restlessness. He would think to himself, "Once I can sit properly, once my mind settles, then I'll have peace. I just need to master this foundational practice first." He worked diligently on his meditation. Gradually, his posture improved. His mind wandered less frequently. After about a year, he could sit for long periods with relative stability. He felt a sense of accomplishment, but the peace he had imagined didn't arrive. Instead, his mind simply identified the next obstacle. "Now I need to understand the teachings more deeply," he thought. "Once I've studied the important texts, once I can grasp the philosophical concepts, then I'll have real peace. I've just been working on the basics." The deeper understanding is what matters. So Tenshin devoted himself to study. He memorized sutras. He wrestled with difficult concepts. He asked the senior monks endless questions. After another year, he had indeed developed substantial knowledge. He could discuss complex teachings. He could explain subtle points of doctrine. Other students would come to him with questions. But again, the peace he sought remained elusive. Instead of satisfaction, he felt a new incompleteness. Understanding concepts isn't enough, he realized. I need direct experience. Once I have a breakthrough, a genuine insight into the nature of reality, then I'll have the peace the masters talk about. Everything until now has just been preparation. Tenshin began working with koans, those paradoxical questions designed to break through conceptual thinking. He would spend days contemplating a single phrase, trying to penetrate its meaning. He barely slept, sitting late into the night with fierce concentration. He felt he was finally getting close to real practice, to the genuine path that would lead to peace. One evening, after a particularly intense meditation session where Tenshin had been struggling with a koan, the head teacher, Master Bankei, found him sitting alone in the meditation hall long after others had retired. "Tenshin," the master said gently, "you're still here." "Yes, master. I'm working on the koan you gave me. I feel like I'm close to understanding it." "Close to understanding," Master Bankei repeated, sitting down nearby. "And when you understand this koan, what will happen?" "Then I'll have genuine insight," Tenshin said. "Then I'll experience the peace that comes from real understanding." "I see. And before you were working on koans, what did you think would bring you peace?" Tenshin paused. "I thought understanding the teachings would bring peace." "And before that?" "I thought mastering meditation would bring peace." "And if you do penetrate this koan," Master Bankei continued, "if you have the insight you're seeking, what will come next?" Tenshin hadn't thought about this. "I suppose there are other koans, deeper levels of understanding. So after you achieve this peace you're seeking, you'll need to achieve another peace beyond it?" The question hung in the air. Tenshin felt something uncomfortable stirring in him. "Tenshin," Master Bankei said quietly, "for 3 years you've been telling yourself that peace is just ahead. First, it was beyond mastering meditation. Then, beyond understanding teachings. Now it's beyond penetrating koans. But has peace actually arrived at any of these thresholds? Or have you simply moved the threshold forward each time?" Tenshin sat in silence. The truth of this observation was undeniable. Each time he had achieved what he thought would bring peace, his mind had simply identified something else that needed to be accomplished first. "The mind has this habit," the master continued. "It says I'll be at peace but when that condition is met, it immediately creates a new condition. Peace is always in the future, always conditional, always dependent on achieving something you haven't achieved yet." "But Master," Tenshin said, confusion and frustration rising in him, "surely we do need to develop our practice. Surely a beginner doesn't have the same peace as an accomplished master?" "Tell me," Master Bankei said, "right now, in this moment, is your breath breathing?" "Yes." "Is your heart beating?" "Yes." "Are you aware of sitting here, of hearing my words, of the candle flickering in the corner?" "Yes." "Then what is missing?" Tenshin opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. What was missing? In this actual moment, was something missing? Or was his mind simply insisting that something should be different, that he should be different, before he could allow himself to be at peace? "You have been practicing for 3 years," Master Bankei said, "but not to arrive at peace." "You've been practicing to earn the right to be at peace." As if peace is something you don't deserve yet, something you must qualify for through achievement. But peace isn't a reward for accomplishment. It's what's here when you stop postponing it. Over the following days, Tenshin sat with this teaching. He noticed how pervasive the postponing habit was. Even during meditation, he would think, "Once my mind is clearer, once this session deepens, then I'll have peace." During meals, "Once I finish eating, once I complete my duties, then I can rest." During work, "Once this task is done, once I've proven my dedication, then I can be at ease." Always peace was just ahead. Always there was one more condition to meet. And because of this constant postponement, he had never actually allowed himself to experience the peace that might be available right now, in this moment, exactly as it was. One morning, Tenshin was sweeping leaves from the monastery path. It was a simple task, routine and ordinary. His mind began its familiar pattern. "Once I finish sweeping, once I move on to more important practice." But then he stopped. He stood still with the broom in his hands and asked himself, "What if I don't postpone peace until after this task? What if peace is available even while sweeping leaves?" He resumed sweeping, but differently. Not rushing to finish, so peace could come afterward. Not treating this moment as an obstacle between him and some future peace. Just sweeping, with the actual experience of sweeping. The sound of the broom against stone. The morning air cool on his skin. The simple rhythm of the movement. And in that ordinariness, something shifted. Not a dramatic breakthrough. Not a sudden enlightenment. Just a quiet recognition that peace had never been waiting in the future. It had been here all along, available in each moment he had been too busy postponing it to notice. Later that day, Master Bankei saw Tenshin sweeping again and noticed something different in his presence. "How is your practice?" the master asked. Tenshin smiled slightly. "I'm learning to stop saving peace for later." Years afterward, when Tenshin taught students of his own, he would tell them about his 3 years of postponement. "I thought peace was something I would earn through achievement," he would say. But it was never about earning. It was about stopping the habit of looking ahead to some better moment and discovering what was here all along. This story reveals what the Zen masters understood about the postponing mind. Tenshin's dedication was genuine. His practice was sincere. But underneath all his effort was an unexamined assumption. Peace comes after achievement. This assumption meant that no achievement was ever enough. Each accomplishment simply revealed another condition that needed to be met. Master Bankei's questions cut through this pattern. Not by denying the value of development or practice, but by revealing that peace isn't earned through reaching certain milestones. Tenshin's breath was breathing, his heart was beating, awareness was present. What was actually missing in that moment? Only his willingness to stop postponing peace until some future condition was met. This teaching doesn't mean we shouldn't practice or develop skills or work toward understanding. It means recognizing that the peace we seek isn't waiting at the end of development. It's available now, in the midst of practice, exactly as we are. When we stop treating this moment as just a stepping stone to some better future moment, we discover that peace was never actually absent. We were just too busy looking ahead to notice it. In a prosperous trading town, there lived a merchant named Yasuhiro. From a young age, he had been driven by a vision of success. He would work hard, build his business, and eventually achieve the comfortable, peaceful life he imagined. That vision kept him going through long days and difficult challenges. When Yasuhiro was young and just starting out, he would tell himself, "Once I have my own shop, once I'm independent, then I'll be content. Then I can relax and enjoy life." He worked for years as an apprentice, learning the trade, saving money. Finally, he opened his small shop in a modest location. He felt proud that first day, excited about his achievement. But within weeks, the excitement faded. The shop was small and poorly located. Customers were few. He found himself thinking, "This isn't enough. Once I have a better shop in a better location, once business is more stable, then I'll have the peace I'm working toward." So he worked harder. He took on extra work. He saved aggressively. After 5 years, he was able to move to a better location, a busier street where people would see his goods. Surely this was the threshold. Surely now he could feel satisfied. But again, after the initial excitement faded, he noticed limitations. His goods were ordinary. To really succeed, he needed to stock finer items, attract wealthier customers. "Once I'm dealing in high-quality goods," he thought, "once I have a reputation for excellence, then I'll have achieved what I set out to achieve." More years passed. Yasuhiro worked relentlessly. He built relationships with suppliers. He developed an eye for quality. Gradually, his reputation grew. Wealthy customers began seeking him out. His income increased substantially. He was able to move to a larger shop, hire assistants, expand his inventory. By this time, Yasuhiro was in his 40s. He had achieved far more than he had dreamed of when he first started. Yet, the peaceful satisfaction he had imagined still eluded him. Instead, he found himself thinking, "I need to secure my position. I need to expand to multiple locations, build something that will last, create real wealth." His wife, Suki, watched this pattern with growing concern. They had enough wealth now to live comfortably. Their children were healthy. They had a beautiful home. Yet, Yasuhiro was always restless, always focused on the next expansion, always working. One evening, Suki asked him directly, "Yasuhiro, when will it be enough? When will you allow yourself to rest?" "Soon," he said, as he always did. "Once I establish the second shop, once I secure our financial future, then I can relax. I'm doing this for us, for our security." But Suki could see what he couldn't. The goalpost kept moving. Each achievement simply revealed another goal beyond it. The peace he was working toward wasn't getting closer. It was remaining always just out of reach. Years continued to pass. Yasuhiro achieved his second shop, then a third. He became one of the most successful merchants in the town. People respected him. His wealth was substantial. His family wanted for nothing material. And yet, in quiet moments, Yasuhiro felt empty, restless. He would lie awake at night thinking about business concerns, about potential expansions, about protecting what he had built. The peace he had been working toward for decades remained elusive. One day, a traveling monk stopped at Yasuhiro's shop. The monk had nothing, just his bowl and his walking staff. Yet something about his presence caught Yasuhiro's attention. The monk moved with unhurried ease. His face was calm, almost luminous. He looked at Yasuhiro's fine goods with appreciation, but no desire. "You have built something impressive," the monk said, looking around the shop. "Thank you," Yasuhiro said. Then, surprising himself, he added, "But I'm not sure it was worth it." The monk looked at him with interest. "What were you hoping it would bring you?" "Peace," Yasuhiro said, the word coming out before he could stop it. "I thought once I had succeeded, once I had built something substantial, I would feel content, at ease. But I don't." "When did you think this peace would arrive?" the monk asked. Yasuhiro thought back. "When I first started, I thought it would come once I had my own shop. Then, once I had a better location. Then, once I had a good reputation. Then wealth. Then security. I keep achieving what I thought would bring peace, but it never does." "Perhaps," the monk said gently, "peace was never in those achievements. Perhaps you were looking in the wrong place." "Where else would it be?" Yasuhiro asked, frustration in his voice. "If success doesn't bring peace, what does?" "May I tell you what I've learned?" the monk asked. When Yasuhiro nodded, he continued, "I used to be like you. I thought peace was something I would find after I had achieved certain things. But then I lost everything. My family, my home, my position. And in that loss, I discovered something unexpected. The peace I had been seeking wasn't in having things or achieving things. It was in stopping the search for it." "That makes no sense," Yasuhiro said. "Doesn't it?" the monk replied. "You've achieved nearly everything you set out to achieve. You have wealth, success, respect. Yet the peace you sought isn't here. Maybe peace was never in the achievements. Maybe it was in the habit of looking ahead to achievements that prevented you from experiencing peace in any moment along the way." The monk prepared to leave, then turned back. "Tell me, in this moment right now, what do you lack? Not in your business plans, not in your future security. Right now, in this breath, what is actually missing?" After the monk left, Yasuhiro couldn't stop thinking about that question. What did he lack right now? His body was healthy. His family was well. His basic needs were abundantly met. The shop was quiet at the moment, peaceful even. So what was missing? Only his willingness to be at peace without first achieving something more. Only his habit of postponing satisfaction until some future condition was met. That evening, instead of working late as he usually did, Yasuhiro went home early. He sat with his wife on their porch as the sun set. He tried something he hadn't done in years. He let himself be there, just there, without his mind racing ahead to tomorrow's concerns. "What's wrong?" Suki asked, noticing the unusual stillness in him. "Nothing's wrong," Yasuhiro said slowly. "That's what I'm realizing. Right now, in this moment, nothing is actually wrong. I've been so focused on making sure the future would be secure that I haven't noticed the present might already contain what I've been seeking. Over the following weeks, Yasuhiro began to notice his postponing habit everywhere. Even during simple moments with his family, his mind would be racing ahead. Even during successful business days, he would be thinking about the next challenge. He was never fully present because he was always preparing for some future moment when he could finally relax. He started a new practice. Several times each day, he would pause and ask himself the monk's question, what is actually missing right now? Not in his plans, not in his ambitions, but in this specific moment. Sometimes the answer was that something genuinely needed attention. But often, the answer was that nothing was missing except his presence to what was already here. Months later, the traveling monk passed through town again and stopped at Yasuhiro's shop. Yasuhiro greeted him warmly. "You look different," the monk observed. "I stopped postponing," Yasuhiro said simply. "I still work. I still maintain my business. But I'm not saving peace for someday anymore. I'm finding it in the ordinary moments I used to think were just obstacles between me and some better future." The monk smiled. "You've discovered what many people work their whole lives without finding. Peace was never in the achievement. It was always here, waiting for you to stop looking beyond it." This story shows how the postponing mind can persist even through genuine achievement. Yasuhiro accomplished everything he set out to accomplish. Yet, each achievement failed to deliver the peace he expected because peace was never in the achievements themselves. It was in the habit of always looking ahead that prevented him from experiencing satisfaction in any present moment. The traveling monk's question was essential. What is actually missing right now? Not in the future, not in our plans and ambitions, but in this specific moment. Often, when we ask this honestly, we discover that what's missing is only our willingness to stop postponing peace until conditions are different. This doesn't mean we shouldn't work toward goals or try to improve our circumstances. Yasuhiro continued running his business, but he stopped treating every present moment as merely a stepping stone to some better future moment. He learned to find the peace he sought not after achievement, but within the ordinary moments he had been rushing through for decades. Both stories reveal the same pattern. Whether we're postponing peace until spiritual achievement or material success, the mechanism is the same. The mind says, "I'll be at peace when," and then moves the target each time a condition is met. This habit can continue indefinitely, keeping peace always just out of reach. The freedom comes not from achieving enough to finally deserve peace, but from seeing through the postponing habit itself. Peace doesn't require perfect conditions, complete understanding, or total success. It's available now in whatever moment we stop insisting it should be somewhere else. When tension stopped postponing peace until after he mastered each level of practice, he discovered it had been available all along in the simple experience of sweeping leaves. When Yasuhiro stopped postponing peace until after each business goal was achieved, he found it in ordinary evening moments with his wife. Neither had to become different or achieve more. They simply had to stop treating this moment as insufficient. This is what the Zen masters pointed toward. Not that development doesn't happen or that achievement doesn't matter, but that peace isn't waiting at the end of development or achievement. It's here when we stop the habit of looking beyond where we are. The Zen masters noticed something about our search for peace. We often believe it exists in certain places and not in others. We think if we could just get away from difficult circumstances, if we could just find the right environment, then we would finally experience the calm we seek. But this belief creates a problem. It suggests that peace depends on external conditions being just right. And if peace requires perfect conditions, it remains forever fragile, always threatened by the next change in circumstances. A monk named Gensho had been practicing at a large monastery for 5 years. The monastery was active and crowded. Over 100 monks lived there, practicing together, working together, eating together. The meditation hall was always full. The work periods were noisy with activity. Meals were communal and sometimes chaotic. Even sleep was shared, with monks sleeping in large common rooms. Gensho found it increasingly difficult to settle his mind amid all this activity. During meditation, he would hear other monks shifting, coughing, breathing. During work periods, conversations and laughter would distract him. During meals, the sounds of eating and occasional talking would pull his attention away from mindful presence. Even during rest periods, he could hear snoring, people turning in their sleep, someone getting up to use the latrine. He began to feel that the environment itself was preventing his practice from deepening. How could he find genuine peace in such constant stimulation? He would think about monks who practiced in quiet mountain hermitages, sitting alone in silence, undisturbed by crowds and noise. That must be where real practice happened. That must be the environment needed for true peace. Gensho spoke to his teacher, Master Tangen, about his frustration. "Master, I feel my practice is being held back by all the activity here. I meditate, but people make noise. I try to work mindfully, but others distract me. I seek quiet, but this monastery is never quiet. I think I need to practice in a more suitable environment." Master Tangen listened carefully. "Where would you like to go?" "I've heard of a hermitage high in the mountains, a day's walk from here. Only 3 or 4 monks live there. It's said to be very quiet, very simple. I think that's the kind of place where I could finally deepen my practice." "You think peace is waiting for you in that hermitage?" Master Tangen asked. "I think I would have a much better chance of finding peace there than here," Gensho replied. To Gensho's surprise, Master Tangen nodded. "You may go. Take 1 month at the hermitage. See what you discover." Gensho felt grateful and excited. Finally, he would have the conditions he needed. Finally, he could practice without constant disturbance. The journey to the hermitage took a full day of walking up steep mountain paths. When Gensho arrived in the evening, exhausted from the climb, he found exactly what he had imagined. A small, simple building surrounded by forest. No crowds, no noise except birds and wind in the trees. The few monks there greeted him quietly and showed him to a small room, his own room, where he could sleep alone. The first few days felt like paradise. Gensho would wake naturally with the dawn light. The morning meditation was silent and undisturbed. No one coughed or shifted. No sounds, but the occasional bird call. During work, which consisted mainly of tending a small garden and maintaining the building, there was no chatter or distraction. Meals were eaten in complete silence. Even the sounds of eating were minimal with so few people. Gensho felt certain he had made the right choice. This was clearly a better environment for practice. His mind would surely settle now. But after about a week, something unexpected began to happen. Without the external distractions of the monastery, Gensho became intensely aware of his own internal noise. His mind seemed even more restless than before. Thoughts arose constantly. Memories, plans, judgments, fantasies. Without external activity to blame for his distraction, he couldn't avoid noticing that his mind itself was creating disturbance. During the quiet meditation sessions, instead of settling into peace, Gensho found himself overwhelmed by the volume of his own thinking. Every thought seemed louder in the silence. Every mental movement seemed more obvious without external activity to mask it. He tried to push the thoughts away, to force his mind into the quietness that the environment offered. But the harder he tried, the more agitated he became. He had imagined that removing external noise would reveal inner peace. Instead, it revealed inner chaos. After 2 weeks, Gensho was more frustrated than he had been at the crowded monastery. At least there, he could blame his restlessness on the environment. Here, in perfect conditions, he had to face the uncomfortable truth that his lack of peace wasn't caused by external circumstances. It was something in his own mind. One evening, Gensho sat with the hermitage's senior monk, an old teacher named Seiyun. They were drinking tea after the evening meal, and Gensho finally spoke about his struggle. "Elder brother, I came here seeking peace, thinking the quiet environment would help my practice deepen. But I'm more agitated now than I was at the monastery. I don't understand what's wrong." Seiyun smiled gently. "What did you leave behind at the monastery?" "Noise, distraction, crowds, all the things that prevented peace." "And what did you bring with you to the hermitage?" Gensho thought about this. "My practice, my dedication." "Your mind," Seiyun finished. "You brought the same mind that experienced disturbance at the monastery. That mind didn't change just because the location changed." "But the conditions here are so much better," Gensho protested. "Better for what?" Seiyun asked. "Better for noticing what's actually happening in your mind, certainly. But not better for creating peace. Peace isn't created by conditions. It's what remains when we stop fighting with whatever conditions we find." He poured more tea into both their cups. "At the monastery, you blamed your restlessness on external noise. The crowds, the activity, the sounds. These gave you something to point to as the cause of your struggle. Here, in quiet conditions, you can't blame external circumstances anymore. So now, what do you see?" "I see that my mind creates its own noise," Gensho said quietly. "Even in silence, it's not quiet." "Yes," Seiyun said. "And this is valuable to see clearly. Your mind's restlessness wasn't caused by the monastery's noise. The noise simply gave your mind something to attach its restlessness to. Now, without that external noise, you can see that the restlessness was always internal." "So coming here was a mistake?" Gensho asked. "Not at all. You needed to see directly that peace doesn't live in any particular place. If I had told you this at the monastery, you would have continued believing that the right environment would solve your problem. Now you know from experience that peace and place are not connected in the way you imagined." Over the remaining 2 weeks at the hermitage, Gensho stopped trying to use the quiet environment to force peace. Instead, he simply noticed his mind's patterns. The constant thinking, the restless seeking, the judgment about whether his practice was good enough. Without external distractions to blame, these patterns became very clear. Something began to shift. Not because the conditions were perfect, but because Gensho stopped demanding that his mind match the external quietness. He let his mind be as it was, restless and noisy, without the extra layer of resistance that came from thinking it should be different. Paradoxically, as he stopped fighting his mind's activity, it gradually began to settle on its own. Not into perfect silence, but into a more spacious quality where thoughts could arise without creating so much disturbance. When his month was complete, Gensho returned to the crowded monastery. Master Tangen asked him what he had learned. "I learned that I carried my restlessness to the hermitage, just as I'll carry whatever peace I find back here to the monastery. Place matters less than I thought. The mind matters more." Master Tangen smiled. "Now you can practice anywhere." And indeed, Gensho found that the monastery's noise and activity no longer disturbed him in the same way. Not because the conditions had changed, but because he had stopped believing that his peace depended on conditions being different. The noise was still there. The crowds were still there. But his relationship to them had changed completely. This story reveals what the Zen masters understood about peace and place. Gensho genuinely believed that his environment was preventing his practice from deepening. The monastery was too noisy, too crowded, too active. This belief seemed completely reasonable. After all, quiet conditions do make certain aspects of practice easier. But the hermitage revealed something crucial. The external noise wasn't creating his inner restlessness. It was simply giving that restlessness something to attach to, something to blame. When the external noise was removed, the inner restlessness remained. In fact, it became more obvious without the convenient excuse of external circumstances. This doesn't mean environment is completely irrelevant. Quiet spaces can support practice in certain ways. But Gensho's mistake was believing that peace lived in the quiet space rather than in his relationship to whatever space he found himself in. He thought peace would arrive once conditions were right. Instead, he discovered that peace emerges when we stop demanding conditions be different than they are. The teaching here isn't that we should never seek quiet or simplicity. It's that we shouldn't mistake temporary relief from external stimulation for genuine peace. True peace doesn't depend on circumstances remaining favorable. It's stable regardless of whether conditions are quiet or noisy, simple or complex, solitary or communal. When Gensho returned to the monastery, the conditions hadn't changed, but his understanding had. He no longer needed the environment to be different before he could be at peace. The noise could be noise. The activity could be activity. And within all of that, peace was available because he had stopped making it conditional on circumstances being just right. At a mountain monastery known for its austere practice, two monks lived very different approaches to their training. Than the first monk was named Ikkyu. He had a restless quality, always seeking better conditions for practice. When winter came and the meditation hall was cold, Ikkyu would think about the warmer hall at his previous monastery. When summer arrived and the hall was hot, he would remember the cooler mountain temple he had heard about. Ikkyu would often ask the abbot for permission to go on brief retreats. He would seek out caves said to be especially conducive to meditation. He would visit temples known for their beautiful gardens, thinking the aesthetic environment would inspire deeper practice. He read about famous practice sites where ancient masters had achieved enlightenment and would plan pilgrimages to these locations. If I could just practice where Master Dogen sat, he would think, perhaps I would grasp what he understood. If I could just sit in the same cave where Master Hakuin had his breakthrough, perhaps that energy would support my realization. The second monk was named Soyen. He had been at the monastery longer than Ikkyu and showed no interest in seeking different conditions. He practiced in the meditation hall, whether it was cold or hot. He worked in the garden through rain and Sunday. He seemed equally present during formal practice and ordinary tasks. When Ikkyu would return from his retreats full of excitement about some special place he had found, Soyen would listen politely but show no inclination to seek such places himself. Ikkyu found Soyen's lack of interest puzzling, even concerning. "Brother Soyen," he said one day, "don't you want to deepen your practice? Don't you want to experience the kind of environments where great masters found realization?" "I practice here," Soyen replied simply. "But surely some places are more conducive to awakening than others," Ikkyu pressed. "Why limit yourself to this one monastery when there are caves, hermitages, sacred mountains where the energy is stronger?" Soyen smiled slightly. "What energy are you seeking?" "The energy of a truly supportive environment. Places where practice naturally deepens, where the conditions are optimal." "And when you find such places," Soyen asked, "does your practice deepen?" Ikkyu paused. This was a difficult question. Each time he visited what he thought was a perfect practice environment, he felt initial excitement and inspiration. But after a few days, his usual patterns would return. His restless mind would find something lacking even in the ideal conditions. The cave was too damp. The hermitage was too isolated. The sacred mountain had too many pilgrims visiting. "Sometimes," Ikkyu said, though the answer felt incomplete even as he spoke it. "And when you return here," Soyen continued, "is your practice sustained by what you found there?" Again, Ikkyu had to admit the truth. The inspiration from special places would fade quickly upon returning to ordinary monastery life. Within days, he would be planning his next retreat, seeking the next special environment. One winter, a severe storm struck the region. Snow fell heavily for days, blocking the mountain paths. No one could leave the monastery or arrive. The community was effectively isolated for nearly 2 months. Ikkyu felt trapped. This wasn't his choice. He hadn't decided to stay at the monastery. The weather had forced it upon him. During those months, Ikkyu's restlessness intensified. He couldn't escape to quieter locations. He couldn't visit inspiring sights. He couldn't seek more optimal conditions. He was stuck with what was right here. He watched Soyen during this time. The older monk's practice seemed completely unchanged by the forced isolation. He sat in meditation with the same steady presence. He worked with the same calm attention. He moved through each day with an ease that didn't seem to depend on having choices about where to practice or what conditions to seek. One evening, frustrated and restless, Ikkyu approached Soyen. "How do you maintain practice when you can't seek better conditions? Don't you feel limited by being stuck in one place?" "Stuck?" Soyen repeated. "I'm not stuck. I'm here." "But doesn't your practice suffer without access to special places? Without the inspiration of different environments?" Soyen set down the robe he was mending. "Ikkyu, let me ask you something. When you visit a sacred cave or a beautiful hermitage, what are you actually seeking?" "I'm seeking conditions that support deeper practice." "But what you call deeper practice, does it depend on where you sit?" If your understanding needs a special cave to be real, is it genuine understanding? If your peace requires perfect conditions to exist, is it real peace? Ikkyu wanted to argue, but something in Soyen's questions struck deeply. He had been practicing for years, seeking optimal conditions, yet still hadn't found the lasting peace he sought. Meanwhile, Soyen practiced in one place with apparent stability. "I think," Soyen continued gently, "you're looking for conditions that will create peace for you. But peace isn't created by conditions. It's what's here when we stop demanding conditions be different." "But surely environment matters," Ikkyu said. "Surely a quiet cave is better for practice than a noisy marketplace." "Better for what?" Soyen asked. "A quiet cave might be easier for certain practices. But if your peace depends on having that cave, then you're not really at peace. You're just temporarily free from disturbance. The disturbance will return the moment conditions change." He picked up his mending again. "I practice here not because this is the perfect place, but because this is where I am. The monastery isn't ideal. The hall is too cold in winter, too hot in summer. The food is simple and sometimes bland. The schedule is demanding. But these conditions don't prevent peace. They're just conditions. Peace doesn't depend on them being different." Over the remaining weeks of winter isolation, Ikkyu began to practice differently. Instead of resenting his inability to seek better conditions, he tried to approach the monastery as Soyen did. Not as an obstacle to overcome or a limitation to escape from, but simply as where practice was happening right now. He noticed how much energy he had been spending on seeking and planning. Energy that could have been going into actual practice. He noticed how each place he sought had seemed perfect from a distance, but revealed limitations once he arrived. He noticed that his restlessness wasn't solved by finding better conditions. It simply relocated to the next dissatisfaction. When spring finally came and the paths cleared, Ikkyu had an opportunity to join a group traveling to a famous mountain temple. In the past, he would have eagerly accepted. But something had shifted. He realized he had been using these journeys as a way to avoid practicing with his actual mind in actual conditions. "Thank you," he told the traveling group, "but I'll stay here." Soyen, overhearing this, smiled but said nothing. Years later, when students would come to Ikkyu struggling with their practice environment, he would tell them about his years of seeking perfect conditions. "I spent so much time looking for the right place to practice," he would say. "I thought peace was somewhere else, somewhere better. But peace was here all along, waiting for me to stop seeking it elsewhere." This second story deepens the teaching about peace and place. Ikkyu's seeking wasn't obviously wrong. He was looking for supportive conditions, which seems reasonable. Sacred sites, quiet caves, beautiful environments can inspire practice. But his constant seeking revealed something deeper. He had made peace dependent on finding and maintaining optimal conditions. Soyen demonstrated a different approach. Not that environment doesn't matter at all, but that peace doesn't depend on environment being perfect. He could practice in the cold hall or the hot hall. He could work in rain or Sunday. His stability came from not requiring conditions to be different before he could be at peace. The forced winter isolation was crucial for Ikkyu. It removed his ability to escape, forcing him to face his restless seeking directly. Without the option to find better conditions, he had to work with the conditions that were present. And in doing so, he discovered that the seeking itself had been the problem, not the conditions he was seeking to escape. This teaching addresses a subtle trap in spiritual practice. We can mistake the search for optimal conditions with actual practice. We can spend years seeking the perfect environment, the ideal teacher, the most supportive circumstances. And while we're seeking, we're not actually settling into practice with what's here. The Zen masters weren't opposed to quiet hermitages or beautiful environments. But they understood that if peace depends on maintaining special conditions, it remains fragile and conditional. True peace is stable regardless of circumstances. It doesn't require noise to disappear or conditions to be perfect. It's available right here, in whatever place we find ourselves. Both stories point to the same insight. We often believe our restlessness would dissolve if only conditions were different. If only we could escape to the right place, find the right environment, create the right circumstances. But this belief keeps us in constant seeking, always looking elsewhere for what might be available right here. The freedom comes not from finding perfect conditions, but from recognizing that peace doesn't depend on conditions being perfect. Quiet places can support certain aspects of practice. Simple environments can make concentration easier. But genuine peace isn't created by these conditions. It emerges when we stop making our well-being dependent on circumstances being just right. When Gensho discovered that he carried his restlessness to the hermitage, he learned that peace isn't waiting in some other location. When Ikkyu stopped his constant seeking of optimal conditions, he found that practice was available in the ordinary monastery he had been trying to escape. Neither had to find the perfect place. They simply had to stop believing peace required one. As our journey through these teachings comes to its natural close, you've traveled through ancient wisdom that the Zen masters discovered about human suffering and peace. You've seen how the mind creates struggle through grasping at what isn't here and resisting what is. You've learned that rejection reveals nothing about your worth, only the conditioned preferences of others. You've discovered how we mistake our conditioning for reality itself, and how comparison creates suffering from thin air. You've explored the habit of postponing peace until some future achievement, always moving the target just out of reach. And you've seen how we search for peace in perfect conditions when it was never dependent on circumstances being just right. Each teaching points to the same simple truth. The peace you seek isn't something to create or achieve or find in some other moment or place. It's what remains when you stop the mental habits that obscure it. You don't need to remember every story or hold on to every insight. These teachings have already done their work simply by being heard. Like seeds planted in good soil, they'll continue unfolding in their own way and their own time. Your only task now is to rest, trusting that understanding deepens naturally when we stop trying to force it. Feel yourself sinking more completely into the support beneath you. Your body knows how to release into sleep without your guidance. Your breath continues its rhythm without your management. The awareness that has been here throughout these stories remains gently present, including rest within itself. All the seeking can stop now. All the mental reaching and pushing can come to rest. The comparing mind can be quiet. The postponing mind can finally arrive in this moment. There's nowhere else you need to be, nothing else you need to become, no other conditions that must be met before you allow yourself this simple peace. The Zen masters understood that sleep is not an escape from awareness, but awareness returning to its most natural state. In this deep rest, all the boundaries we maintain during waking life naturally soften. The stories about who we are and who we should be can dissolve for these hours. What remains is simply the peaceful awareness that was here before all the stories began. May your sleep tonight be deep and restorative. May you rest in the understanding that peace was never absent, only overlooked. May you wake refreshed, carrying this quiet knowing into whatever tomorrow brings. Sleep well, and thank you for joining us here at Sleepy Monk.